Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
This is something for the families of those affected. A chain of events that I've bore witness to and need to leave a record of. It started innocently enough. I was sitting out on the patio with a small fire. The way the flames danced was entrancing, like a belly dancer caught in a strobe light. I knew I shouldn't touch it, but my hand drew close to the tips of the flickering flames. My body kicked in and jerked my hand back from the heat. Something urged my hand back to the tips of the flames. The flames kissed my fingertips. I jerked my hand back intentionally. Red, wrinkled, I could still feel the heat trapped under my skin. I couldn't put my fingers on what made me do it. If I'm being honest, it hurt like hell. Yet it seemed worth it. Those red and orange hips flicking back and forth in my fire pit. I put the cage over the top of the pit and went inside. I felt a certain tugging to go back out to it. I fought it and went to bed. That night was rough. I kept waking up with a certain compulsion to go check the fire. I finally went to look at the fire pit from my bedroom window. The flames were still burning strong. I forced myself back to bed. When I woke up, the fire was still burning. The next morning, I found myself back out on the patio. I couldn't stop watching it. I remember seeing that face for the first time. It was vague, but the eyes and mouth were staring at me, fueled by the hot coals. I checked my watch. Somehow I had lost 2 hours. I rushed to work, reeking of smoke. During my lunch break, I watched it rain. The whole ride home, I could smell myself. I considered rolling the windows down so the rain would wash the smell away. When I got home, I went to the kitchen window and looked outside. The fire was raging. It had managed to somehow grow even against the pouring rain. The next thing I know, I'm standing out in the rain, holding a mouse over the fire. The face in the fire looked contented. Where'd the mouse go? I must have dropped it. I hadn't gotten much sleep the night before. I went about my day. Nothing else was out of the ordinary. A few days passed. My days were normal, other than the fire that refused to die. I went downstairs to get my morning coffee. The clock on my coffee maker read 6:35 a.m. The next thing I remember is pouring the coffee into my favorite mug and seeing 8:26 a.m. I hadn't sidetracked. I looked out the kitchen window and the flame was considerably larger than it was before. It was higher than the cage on my fire pit. The face was getting more defined. It was becoming feminine in its curvatures. It stared right through me and seemed to nod in approval to me. I looked around. The only thing out of the ordinary was a black high-heeled shoe sitting in my sink. My stomach turned. I remembered the mouse hanging there by its tail. Did some poor woman find herself fueling my fire? I threw the shoe in the pit. I called in sick, then sat in a hot shower. My skin crawled. 2 hours gone. Did I murder someone? I can't recall even seeing another person this morning. A moment of sudden clarity came to me. Skin under my fingernails. I dug through my living room. Insurance pamphlets, sales contracts. 8 a.m. My address in her planner. I sat on my couch in awe. No blood. A little tossed up, but relatively neat. Where was she? I searched my own house. Attic, basement, closets. No body. The fire couldn't have possibly consumed a whole person in that short period of time. Could it? I had to get out. I left my house without incident. I wanted help. I'm by no means a man of God, but I would have started going to church right then if it would all stop. I went to the first church I could find. I hauled up in the confession booth. "What would you like to confess, my son?" I checked my watch. No time loss. I'm not sure, Father. Surely there are transgressions which you would like to be absolved of? I think I may have killed an insurance saleswoman, I offered. You think? Do you not know? I really don't know what happened to her, but I found her shoe in my sink. I guess that's why I'm here. Son, I don't know that I can help with those kinds of problems. I think there's something evil at my house, I pleaded. I keep losing hours at a time. I wake up doing things that normally I'd never do. The priest was silent. Every breath was burdened by the situation I laid before him. I waited for what seemed like years. I was starting to expect Jesus himself to walk through the doors before he'd give me another word. He gave a heavy exhale. When you wake up, what are you doing? Usually putting things into my fire pit. And the fire never goes out either. So you know what it is. I heard the light door to the confessional spring back to the shut position. I raced out after him. He was making a break for his office. I grabbed his arm. He jerked around, his face red like the backside of a baboon. "Release me, foul thing!" he shouted, grabbing my wrist. I stared into his eyes. I felt hopeless. My legs fell under me. I sobbed on the floor. Where else could I go for help? He knew where I could get help. He even knew what was going on, and he locked himself in his office. I crawled to a pew. I waited. Hours. I waited longer. I must have fallen asleep because suddenly it was sunny again, and there was the priest, tapping my shoulder. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. He handed me a beat-up business card. It was plain white, plain black text. It just had an address. "Get out and don't come back," he said in a tone that warned me not to push my luck. I got up and went to my car. The address wasn't too far away, so I decided to see what this suggestion of his was. The building was how I imagined the business card was years ago. Plain, white, clean. It wasn't a home, but it wasn't obviously a business either. I approached the door and knocked. I knocked again. I wanted to leave, but I needed help in a bad way. The door opened quietly by a large older man, his white hair wild. He had to have been well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders of a linebacker and the white collar of a priest. "Can I help you?" he asked nonchalantly. I handed him the card. "A priest gave me this." He gave me a suspicious look up and down. "What kind of trouble are you having?" "I'm not really sure," I admitted. He motioned for me to come in. As I passed him, he took a big whiff of me. "You smell like a fireplace." We sat in what looked like an old-fashioned study. He lit a candle on his desk. It danced quietly. Then the tip was sucked in towards the candle. It smashed and squeezed into a little mouth and bit at the air above the wick. "Aye, the fire ghosts," he said to himself, pursing his lips in thought. "Those are a pain in the arse. What are they?" "What are you?" "I don't really know what they are. I just try to get rid of them before they try to eat every damn thing." "Me? I like to think of myself as a philanthropist. I like to spend my free time helping the less fortunate." He paused for a moment. "And right now, it looks like you're less fortunate." I couldn't argue with that. He told me to go home and tell it to get the hell out of my house. He seemed reasonably informed on the situation, so I trusted him. He gave me some kind of communion or blessing or something, and I departed for my home, assuming it was still standing. The ride home was short, and when I arrived, the front porch was lined with lit candles. I didn't own a single candle. I sat in my car, working up the nerve. "That is your house," I yelled at myself with the windows rolled up. "You get your ass in there and tell them." I was fired up. I puffed my chest out, threw my shoulders back with my head held high, and marched my average frame up the steps. I busted through the door like a ton of dynamite. A faint smell of char, a subtle haze of smoke in the air. "Get the fuck out!" I screamed like I was someone, loud enough that I felt the veins in my neck strain against my skin. The crackle of fire guffawed to my house. 2 letters burned themselves into the wall of my living room. N-O. My blood boiled. I worked my ass off for this. I didn't ask for shit like this to come into my life. "Get out now!" I bellowed, nearly burping the flames from my belly. The fire flared from the wall towards me. Between angry and stupid, I stood steadfast. The flames parted, millimeters from my face. They lashed out over and over, slowly coming closer as if burning through an invisible barrier. I finally came to my senses and ran back to my truck. I went back to the priest and gave him the rundown. "It's really not safe to keep candles burning while you're gone," he said dryly. "I don't even own candles," I assured him. A chill ran down my spine. Then why the fuck didn't those flames incinerate me? He laughed to himself. He didn't seem surprised. "Son, I blessed you in case it wasn't a pushover. I'm glad you made it." He smacked me on the shoulder and headed for the door. "Take me to your place," he sighed. "This is a job for old men." When we got to my place, I followed him in. He tried to discourage me, but ultimately I had to see what he could possibly do. He took his clerical collar off, then proceeded to completely disrobe, save for his tidy whities. He was littered with trophies of battles long past, burnt skin that never returned to its normal state, long dark scars that traversed his muscular frame like tattoos. He took a long, slow breath, and very gently pushed open the unlatched front door. He braced himself, his feet in a broad stance. A blaze of fire ripped through my living room and towards the front door. His broad, battered hands snapped up to chest level and gripped it like he'd grabbed a raging bull by the horns. With a grunt, he threw the fire away from him. It was like watching a sumo wrestler. He waddled into the house with a wide-legged stance. I couldn't detect fear or uncertainty. "He asked you to leave," he said into the house, loudly but without force, like an elementary teacher. He stepped to the side. An invisible something slammed into my bookshelf. The shelves cracked and the paperbacks tumbled to the floor. He hit his chest firmly with his right fist. A challenge. Flames spit up around him in a circle. He braced. The flames collapsed in on him like a ring of waves converging on a single point. The priest let out a commanding bark and started pushing the flames back with his bare hands. The scars across his body burned bright red like hot steel. His muscles struggled. Then, everything was silent. All I could hear was my breathing. His breathing. My heart. His heart. His grip released, and his flat palm stood out against the onslaught of sentient flame. I watched his face twist, his mouth scream silently as the flame sucked into his hands. The scars burned brighter. He dropped to one knee, gasping for air. I ran to his side and tried to help him up, but burned my hands. His skin was hot enough that I couldn't stand to be within feet of him. His body cooled, and I helped him into his priestly attire. I took him back, but he wouldn't answer a single question on the ride back. When he climbed from my truck, he reminded me, "No one will believe you if you send them to me. I'm just a broken old man, broken from the years I spent at war as a young man." He smiled and gave me a friendly nod. I never saw him again. I didn't even have his name to watch for his obituary. You know, just in case.
Chapter 1. Man's Best Friend. The sound of Dwayne's Dodge diesel pounded a steady thump with a deep cadence as it idled up the dirt drive to the barn. The sun was setting, but it still hung just above the ridge that rose above their farmhouse. No snow yet, but Dwayne's bones shivered deep as his chilled hands gripped the steering wheel while it jerked back and forth from the tires wrestling the ruts. He glanced down at his grip. His fingers began to cramp. Damn cold arthritic joints seemed to let him know that winter was a-comin' nowadays after turning 50. He could feel snow before it ever came, and it would be here before Thanksgiving, which was about 2 weeks out. He scanned the fence line looking for old Tick, his short American bulldog and pit mix, who always sat at the top of the hill by the barn waiting if he hadn't been lucky enough to get to ride with him. Surely he hadn't run off again. Damn portly friend was smarter than he should be in some ways, but dumber than a box of rocks in others. But he and Tick were true friends through and through to the end. As the Dodge slowly pulled up to the barn, Dwayne eased the gear shift into park and scrutinized his surroundings once more. Nope, no fat dogs sitting and waiting today. Dwayne's wrinkled cheeks stretched a bit from the smile growing as he had thought of last summer's escapades, battling wits to keep Tick from slipping out and wreaking havoc. Scott Maynard, his neighbor, and he had shared some harsh words over Tick, frolicking on Scott's place. According to Scott, the neighbor to the east, Tick was growing quite an appetite for chicken. Live chicken. Scott's chickens. Good boy, Tick. He quietly snickered as he sat, letting past thoughts mingle in his head. That damned neighbor's chickens and roosters were always causing a damned racket over here, waking him and Annalene up too early every single morning. Only difference was, he weren't no prick about it. So, if Tick could sneak over and take one out occasionally, things was square in his thoughts. He reminisced digging the trench around the backyard and laying that invisible fence wire to keep old Tick at home and away from the chicken ranch. The sad look his faithful boy wore as he cinched the transmitter collar around his chubby neck. This ought to keep you hunting ass at home and away from that asshole's chickens. Another snicker ended with a guffaw. I hate to do it, boy, but Scott'd just soon pepper your butt with birdshot or more. And I love you, buddy, but I ain't gonna pluck pellets out of your round ass. I'd do the world for you, boy, but your hind end is off limits, a bridge I refuse to cross. The next day, after pulling up the drive and heading into the house, had Dwayne scratching his head when Tick weren't there waiting at the back door. His wife, Annalene, laughed as she told him the story about Tick. Dwayne, that dang dog of yourn is smart as a fox. I was out back in the screened-in porch reading my book, and I kept hearing this high-pitched squeal. It sounded like it was a mouse coming from inside of Tick. He was laying as close to that trench he had dug as he could. Pretty soon that noise began to fade, and old Tick got up from the ground and slowly walked over the pile of dirt and headed Scott's way with nary a care. It didn't make him yelp like the first time or two. Dwayne smiled to himself. His smart bully had somehow figured out he could lay next to the invisible fence to let his collar beep with the warning sound telling him he was about to get a shock if he moved closer. That critter just laid there until the damned battery went dead. No more shock left in the collar. I knew that dog was smarter than the average pooch, Dwayne answered. Nevertheless, Scott's gonna shoot your smart dog. I suppose Tick ain't as brainy in the long game as he thinks." As Dwayne sat daydreaming, he began to smell the diesel fumes leaking up into the cab strong, but he was deep down memory lane and smiled as he had concocted the next way to outsmart Tick. He pulled that collar off, and Tick looked up at him like he had won the battle. Little did he know, but Dwayne had just drilled a hole in that danged old speaker so it couldn't give no warning sound no more. Next morning, Tick didn't know what to do when he wrapped that collar back around his woollied neck and marched him out the back door and turned to leave without him. Dwayne felt so damned proud of himself, even if he did see Annalene shaking her head in disbelief. "How much you spend on all that stuff Tick is making you tear up, Dwayne? Maybe you ought to just take your furry friend with you, instead of matching wits with him." That was all his little old sweet potato had to say to him, but Dwayne was satisfied with his line of action. He had finally fixed the problem, for a day or two. Annalene told him that third evening she had never seen old Tick move as quick as he did. It was as if Tick knew if he just bolted across that trench and kept going, the electric sting would only bite for a second and then let go and be gone. Hell, Dwayne was just about ready to shoot old Tick himself, but with the holiday coming, he reckoned he felt soft about losing such a smart dog. Dwayne shook his head with the thought and smirked. He knew he couldn't ever get rid of Tick. Tick was his best bud. A damned holiday miracle happened instead. Before he knew what he was doing, Dwayne's finger had dialed up the Maynard's number after he decided to invite him to Thanksgiving dinner for he had time to change his mind. Dwayne felt just as surprised as Annalene's face showed shock when she heard words she had never guessed would come out. "It's time to mend differences and be neighborly. Don't ask me why, Annalene. It just happened. If the Pilgrims and Indians could do it," he paused, "I can by God do it." "Dwayne Lee Johnson, Jr." Annalene shook her head as she continued walking up to him, arms opening up to hug him. "You never cease to give me warm shivers." Her eyes warmed and she licked her lips seductively. "I reckon my cockles are warmed up tonight." She pulled him in and leaned in toward his ear, her lips brushing against it. "Warmed and frisky, baby." He smiled and reached around to give a squeeze to her backside. "I'm old and grumpy sometimes, but I ain't dead nor blind. I still got wants and needs." He smiled. Chapter 2. Husband's Bestest Friend. Dwayne had put the happiest smile on Annalene's face she had worn in a long time. She was nestled into his chest before she rolled over to be face to face. "I thought I had lost you for good to that damn dog, for certain." She grinned. "I know they say man's best friend is his dog. I was beginning to think it was true." She ran her finger down Dwayne's chest. "What's up with you? Inviting my family to Thanksgiving? Hell, inviting the Maynards?" She looked deep into her husband's eyes. "What's going on inside that brain of yours, Dwayne Lee? I mean, I like it." Dwayne drew a deep breath before letting it out slowly. He cupped his hand over Annalene's and inhaled again. "You ever feel like there's something dark hanging over your head?" "I'm not sure what you mean. You feeling down or?" "I don't know. I just feel different. Been full of anger lately and venom spitting out of my mouth all the time. Maybe it's just the season or something, but lately I've been feeling like I'm taking life and all I got for granted. Remember about this time last year when I found who we thought was Tick, all bloody and dead in the doghouse? I was sure I'd lost my buddy. I mean, how many other black and white bully pits could be out here on our road?" Annalene smiled somberly. "I know, Tick is one of a kind. I remember how devastated you were when you came in to tell me he had wandered back and had been hit and was gone." Her eyes teared just a bit. "I'll never forget how you looked, Dwayne. I thought I might as well have lost you too." I remember how frozen the damn ground was and how long it took me to dig that big of a hole, especially with my eyes so full of tears. What's making you think of that awful day, Dwayne? Don't know, Annaline. This past week or two, I've been feeling sorry for myself, and then suddenly, I'm realizing how much I have to be thankful for. Like you. I take you for granted so dang much, and Dick coming back like a miracle, even though his Houdini tricks piss me the hell off constantly. Dwayne, I'll never forget after you came in all sweaty, even though it was below freezing after you buried Dick. Hearing that scratching on the back door. I know, Annaline. It was like we were being haunted by his ghost. Remember how we both stared at each other? You looked at me like, am I crazy? Dwayne guffawed. You got up so sudden, even though you were dead tired and frozen. We both got to that back door pretty darn fast. Annaline began running her fingers down Dwayne's chest again. You flung that door open and there he was, back from the dead. Annaline snuggled in and kissed her husband's lips, giggling from the mustache and beard hairs tickling. There he was, wanting in like he'd just been let out to pee. Dwayne kissed Annaline, running his tongue across her bottom lip. I know, babe. I never figure out whose dog I buried that cold and frigid day. I'm just glad it wasn't Tick. He leaned into Annaline's ear. Tick may be my best friend, but you, Annaline, are my bestest friend. Tick moaned a low, growly grumble as if he were listening from outside the door and objecting to being his master's second fiddle. Dwayne got up to let him in, and just before he opened the bedroom door, he turned back to Annaline. Get ready, sweet potato, 'cause here he comes. As the door was opened, Tick bullied his way through and flew up and onto the middle of the bed, claiming his spot between them. Chapter 3. The Dinner Guests. Scott looked over at his wife, Mary. What the hell is going on? Have you been talking to Annaline and cooking this whole Thanksgiving dinner thing up? Hell no, Scott. I'm still wondering why you agreed for us to go. He caught me off guard. So much I even agreed to smoke some meat to bring over. I'd smoke some chickens, but that damn dog has already ate several of them. The way I understand it, Annaline's sister and husband will be there too. The whole damned goody-good bunch. Should I break out some venison? And waste good meat on them? You're kidding, right? Well, I ain't gonna go buy nothing. Why did you say we'd bring the main course? Chips or something would have been better. A green bean casserole or rolls. Hell, the meat's the most expensive part of dinner. You ought to cook up something gross like snake or roadkill. She cackled. Kill that fucking dog of theirs that keeps killing our chickens and smoke his ass for their Thanksgiving party. Mary squinted at Scott with an evil sneer. Now that would be some funny shit there. Watching that geezer eat his own damn dog. Scott laughed out loud. Now that I could do. If he shows his damn pork butt over here before next Thursday. They both laughed hysterically. Hell, I may coax that fat turd over myself with a chicken. Mary sounded as she appeared to have a thought. You know. Scott looked over. Uh-oh. Looks like you got those evil cogs in your head going. I'm just a-thinking we can make this little neighborly get-together real interesting. I like the sound of your wicked tone. Be great if those old farts never felt the urge to call us back again. Never have liked them since we moved to the neighborhood. Old farts think they know everything, and that damn chicken-eating dog. Scott's scowl changed to wonder. What kind of idea do you have brewing, Mary? Oh, I have the perfect casserole that will go along with smoked bulldog. We'll bring them a special meal they will be so thankful for. It'll be a Thanksgiving meal none of them will ever forget." Mary's eyes were dark yet glimmered with joy. "You just get that stupid dog of theirs in your smoker. I'm going to use some of our mushrooms for a tasty side dish." Mary's laugh was insidious. Chapter 4. Tick is gone again. Dwayne rolled up the drive and right off the bat noticed Tick wasn't at the barn waiting. Old Tick must be getting too long in the tooth to sit outside in the cold. Dwayne parked the old Dodge and gave a quick look-see around the barn. He shook his head. "I'm gonna start bringing you with again." Annalene was at the door to greet Dwayne as he stood in the coat room taking off his Carhartt and boots. The time change was making it darker sooner, which made the days feel colder and more depressing. Annalene knew Dwayne's mood was changing. He needed sunlight to keep his spirits up the more the years passed. "Tick asleep in the living room?" he asked. "No, I thought you had taken him with you today. I haven't seen him since early this morning. I've been busy all day with getting all the fixings together for Thursday." "I hope he hasn't disappeared over to the Maynards again, and just before our big meal." Dwayne headed for the back door. After walking out on the screened porch and glancing around the yard, he felt a sharp pain in his stomach. It was followed with a feeling of dread. "Hey, Dick," he yelled out. "Come by, boy." Touched his middle finger and edge of his thumb to his lips and sharply blew, causing the loud whistle that usually brought Dick running around the corner of the house. He waited several seconds and attempted again. Nothing. Dwayne hesitantly closed the back door and moped through the kitchen. He didn't answer, Annalene. "Give him a while. He's probably out scrounging the barn or shed." "Hope to God he isn't terrorizing chickens. It'll be difficult to have a peaceful dinner with Scott and Mary shooting daggers at me with their eyes." Wednesday morning, Dwayne was up before sunrise, walking around his property looking for Tick. At 8 a.m., he was in the living room with the phone to his ear, listening to the ring sound, hoping Scott would answer with news he could live with. "No, Dwayne, haven't seen him. Chickens have been quiet all week." He looked over at Mary and smiled a devilish grin. "So, we still on for Thanksgiving?" "Yeah, I'm sorry. Hope he shows up soon. Maybe he's out frisking with a hot little blue heeler or something." "All right, we'll be there tomorrow around noon with some smoked brisket and Mary's favorite casserole. Looking forward to it." "Yep, you too. Good luck." Click. Chapter 5. A Thanksgiving to Remember. Just before the Johnsons' door opened, Mary reminded Scott, "Don't eat the casserole. Put a small amount on your plate and bury it under some other dishes, unless you want the trip of a lifetime." "Gotcha, babe. And unless you like meat other than beef, stick to the top layer on the plate," he snickered. The door swung open and Annalene was there to greet Scott and Mary. "Come on in, neighbors. This is my little sister Claire and her husband Ben. They live over in Duke County, just past Stack's Mill on Turner's Corner." "Nice to meet y'all. I'm Scott Maynard and this is my sweetheart Mary. We just moved in next door about a year and a half ago. This is real nice you included us, Dwayne. Annalene." "Can I take those dishes out to the kitchen?" Annalene asked. "They smell wonderful." "I sure enough hope they meet up with your standards. They're both Scott's favorites," Mary answered. "Hope you don't mind a little beer drinking with some football on the tube, Scott. Kind of the family Thanksgiving tradition around here," stated Dwayne. "Football, beer, brisket, and the fixins? Life don't get no better." Scott smiled as he responded. His face faked a somber transition. "Did your pup show up?" he asked with drippy concern. Dwayne's mood dimmed. "Nah, I'm still hoping he's just pulling another couple of all-nighters with one of the neighbor's bitches in heat. With any luck, there'll be little cloned puppies come spring." He tried to smile, but if he knew Dwayne, One could tell he was hurting inside. "Have a seat, Scott, and I'll grab you a beer," Annalene said. "Mary, you can come out to the kitchen with Claire and I or watch football out here. Table's already set and I'm just doing some last-minute touches." Ben laughed at whatever joke was told. The truth was, he had had several beers and didn't really hear what was said. It's hard to hear with all the hen cackling going on in the kitchen. Scott and Dwayne both chuckled. Dwayne's appeared a bit forced. "Dwayne, I'm sure sorry about your dog. What was his name?" "His name is still Tick. He'll be back. He has a habit of flying the coop occasionally." Dwayne intentionally tied Tick's disappearance to the word coop. He had felt Scott was trying to be coy, and something about his demeanor today made him sorry he had ever invited him. He didn't want the tension to grow, but he wouldn't put up with any shit from some young move-in. He glanced out to the kitchen where he caught a glimpse of Annalene. She gave him a subtle look, and he winked back at her with an everything-is-fine look in his eyes. Dinner was served, and the table was full of a variety of dishes sitting on the lazy Susan in the middle of the table. Annalene stood before anyone began serving and spoke. "This tradition may be new to our guests," she nodded at Scott and Mary, "but we've always gone around the table and spoke one thing we are thankful for in this year of life that is about to turn the page onto the next. I'll start. I'm personally thankful that this year we have new additions to our tradition. Thank you for Scott and Mary." There was silence around the table. Dwayne cleared his throat, and then there was a brief hesitation. I normally suck at this kind of thing. I'm a quiet, well-weathered old guy, and I reckon I'm already the most fortunate man that there ever was. I was blessed with a woman who I truly don't deserve. She stuck by me through it all. She still loves me with all my faults. I'm thankful. I'm blessed. I'm also saddened on this blessed day, but damn it, I'm hungry too. Annalene, I love you, sweet potato. Always will. Tick, you damned old cantankerous friend, get your ass home. And last but not least, pass that brisket as quick as possible. Silence again. "I guess I'll just say the obvious," Ben began. "I love my wife, Claire. Married into a much more stable and loving family than I ever came from. I'm thankful for that. Great in-laws, wonderful wife, nice farm, and now some new friends. Prayers Tick makes it home, 'cause I know how much he means to Dwayne. Amen." I just echo what my wonderful husband just said. I'll add that I'm thankful Scott and Mary are here to share this meal and day with us too. Claire pinched her eyes closed even tighter. Scott cleared his throat and quickly began speaking. "I wasn't sure what this day was gonna bring, honestly. We ain't been the best of neighbors, and I'm feeling a bit ashamed of that fact at the moment. My wife and I aren't the easiest people to get to know, and I realize that. I'm thankful that these people saw past our unneighborliness and invited us, nonetheless. I'm thankful and hope everyone enjoys this day and what the unknown can bring." Mary snickered under her breath. She fidgeted a moment before stuttering, "I ain't no public speaking kind of person. This has been eye-opening, and I'm hoping everyone eats up and enjoys. The way I see it, we all gonna have moments we ain't expecting. I just say be thankful for whatever they bring, understanding them or not. Sometimes it's those experiences you don't expect that bring you the clearest answers you didn't even know was questions. And I guess that's all I got to say about it. Dig in and eat up. Amen." Annalene spun the dishes on the lazy Susan over to the newest guests. "Your special company, you go first." "No, ma'am, you're the host. I insist you start. All the trouble you went to and to include us, I insist." Scott then spun the main course to Annalene. Everyone took turns serving themselves the food that was in front of them. Scott looked around and noticed that everyone's plates were full of the smoked meat and casserole he and Mary had brought. The conversation lulled occasionally as everyone enjoyed tasting the different dishes. "Scott, this smoked brisket is really good. It's flavorful like I've never tasted before, and very tender," Annalene commented. "Do you have a special marinade?" Ben asked. Scott smiled before he answered. Yes, I do. It's a special family secret recipe. So y'all like the flavor? Some people say there's a bit of a bite to it, but I think it's tasty. No bark at all." Claire chimed in. "This casserole is wonderful too. Is this egg and mushrooms?" Mary nodded. "Again, like Scott said, it's my family's recipe. I'm glad you like it. Eat up. I don't want to take anything home. This was made just for you folks for your kindness." "This is beef brisket, right, Scott?" Dwayne asked. "Yep, 100% right out of the pit." He glanced at Mary. "It has an odd texture. Very good, though," Dwayne complimented. The conversations remained steady, each complimenting the other's offerings as the bowls, dishes, and pans each became less and less full. 20 minutes later, Scott and Mary began noticing eyes becoming glossier and the grins becoming wider across the other guests' mouths. The fun was just about to begin. Scott was questioning his motive after the warming and thankful comments that had been shared just before the meal began. But it didn't take long to stir the memories of Dwayne's damned bully pit wreaking devastation on his chickens and the lack of care Dwayne showed when he had complained about his dog. Mary, on the other hand, was enjoying herself watching as the others began tripping. She knew Annalene had been very judgmental about her and Scott when they moved in. She had heard talk about Annalene questioning others in town because of all the visitors they received and the odd hours she and Scott kept. "Damn busybody old bogies," she quietly thought as she began realizing they were beginning to see trails in their vision in the movement of their hands and arms when gesturing in conversation. The grins and giggles were beginning to overtake the unsuspecting victims. It wouldn't be long before they would be putty in her hands. Their good trips would be redirected into nightmares. Mary giggled both at the thought and the sight of the show before them. Knowing Dwayne was eating his favorite dog in the world gave her butterflies in her stomach. If he only knew. But he sure as hell would find out very soon. Dwayne sliced another bite from the strip of dog that lay across his plate, his now dilated pupils filling up his entire eyeballs. Mary looked at Scott and winked. Scott smiled and shook his head as he eyed the long carving knife laid beside the dish of meat. His eyes skimmed across the 4 oblivious dupes that were quickly sliding out of reality into the wacky antics of psilocybin mushroom world. He looked over at the dish and then to Mary. "You must have really sweetened the taste of your casserole, honey. These clowns really cleaned their plates. I'm thinking they're way overdosed." He laughed wickedly. He got up and excused himself to the bathroom as he winked once more to his wife. His plan was to run outside to his truck and collect the zip ties he had gathered for the late afternoon activities. Annalene began to say something to Scott but looked over at her sister and broke into uncontrollable giggles. Ben and Dwayne began to speak, but neither seemed able to spit their words out correctly. They too quickly began laughing, their mouths grinning so widely from cheek to cheek their faces began to look as if they'd split. This seemed to add to Claire's laughter, which drew Annalene into the collection of hysterical cackles. As Scott exited the front door, he smiled at Mary, acknowledging her expertise in the plan for retribution against the Johnsons for being less than welcoming a year and a half ago when they moved in next door. She mouthed the sentence very clearly to him before he walked out. "I get to slit that fucking bitch's throat. She's mine." And then she blew a kiss to her man as the storm door slammed closed with a loud thwack and brought a quick silence that turned into more uproar of laughter when nothing else happened. Chapter 6. Animated Perspectives. Dwayne shook his head back and forth while he sat at the table. He looked at the can of beer that stood firm beside his nearly empty plate. He stared blankly as the colors and textures of the piles of leftovers gently began to move and mix, forming what appeared to be a new life form from some alien planet. He snickered to himself, but deep down, he felt a brewing fear. His heart was racing, forming excitement within, but his muscles and tendons to cause movement were dueling with his brainwaves. The signals were crossing, and he knew it. It caused frustration, but then the need to laugh overtook him again. The beer can was becoming a tall silo sitting on the table. It begged him to pick it up to take a sip, but his lack of coordination would not allow it to be. He knew the world he was now entrapped was not the world he had known earlier in the day. He feared this world would be the one he was lost in forever. And while that should create fear within, he felt another barrage of laughter building and ready to overflow from his insides. He scanned the room for his sweet potato, Annalene. He felt like he needed to protect her. Noises of the football game in the living room began to build louder, and as it blended or churned into the laughter and sounds of people talking around the table, it became impossible to divide one sound from the other and understand what was happening. Dwayne was stuck in a world he couldn't fathom, and it was building into a panic that was pushing his heart into overdrive. Annalene's laughter ended abruptly. It was as if a door slammed loudly or the clap of thunder snapped her brain into an abrupt stop. Her eyes were as wide as saucers as she scanned the area, dividing familiar faces with those that didn't fit completely into her psyche. The front door slammed again and drew her attention. Annalene knew it was the neighbor, but somehow couldn't remember him leaving the table. Her mind stirred, trying to piece together the previous moments. It was as if the jigsaw puzzle she had just finished were now scattered about on the floor for no reason. Ben and Claire sat talking and giggling with each other as if no one else were present in the room. And Mary, Scott's wife? The smile she boldly wore scared Annalene. She was clueless why, but her urge to laugh was suddenly transformed into the need to scream for help. Scott walked up behind Dwayne and slipped pieces of plastic around his wrists and then pulled his hands behind him. Dwayne looked stunned but made no attempts to resist. Scott then walked around the table and did the same thing to Ben before he knew what was happening. There was nothing but confused silence as each of the family members sat still, glassy eyes with large dark pupils lost in the middle of their large white orbs. Scott zip-tied Claire's hands together and then worked his way further around the table to Annalene, where in her stunned state, held her hands up to be hog-tied also. Mary scooted her chair away from the table and slowly stood up. She walked over to Scott and they both looked into each other's eyes. "Oh, baby, I told you this would work out perfect." She smiled and then moved her lips closer to his before sliding her tongue out and teasing Scott. Everyone sitting confined at the table watched in confusion. A snicker slipped out of Ben's mouth before he let the words spill. "You guys gonna do it right here in front of us?" Silence. Scott pulled back from his wife's lips and grip. He slowly walked over and picked up the pan of meat. He walked over to Dwayne and stopped as he stared at him. He set the plate in front of Dwayne and then took a fork and knife and began cutting a bite-sized piece of the brisket. "You really enjoyed the flavor and tenderness, didn't you?" He questioned Dwayne as he lifted the fork and brought it up to Dwayne's mouth. "You like another bite? See if you can't taste something familiar." He released a low, rumbly, and raspy guffaw. "It certainly was satisfying smoking this meat. In fact, it's the first time I've ever skinned dog and marinated it for the smoker. I must admit, though, I myself did not taste it as a true chef would to make sure it was satisfactory, as I don't believe I'd care for canine." He smiled again. "But by the way y'all ate it up, I'm guessing old Tick made quite a tasty main course. Hell, he probably has a flavorful undertone of chicken, too. As many of mine as he fucking ate." It took a few moments for Scott's statement to take hold. Their fucked up minds just couldn't process what the sentence really meant. It was Claire, whose stomach first began to heave up and down. Her face first pale white before becoming shades of yellowish green. "You ain't gonna make a mess on Annalene's dinner table, are you?" Mary questioned. "'Cause I'll make you lick it right back up. Probably won't be quite as delightful the second go-round." Mary smiled. "Now buck up, Miss Pretty Little Prim and Proper. The fun is just beginning. Mary's eyes became dark slits that sank deep into her darkened sockets, and her look sent instant shivers up Claire's spine. Y'all treated us like shit for 1.5 years, talking trash about us in town and letting your damn dog destroy our chickens. And you think a little holiday dinner is going to clear consciences and make us all hunky-dory happy neighbors? Well, bullshit. It's time to play now, and it's by our rules. Ain't that right, Scott? Her dark hair hung over her eyes as her witch-like thin face grew more hate-filled by the second. We're going to see you take torture while y'all flying high. Yeehaw! Mary cackled. Silence once again, except for Claire's sniffles and Mary's giggles. Everyone else, except for Scott, sat in a bewildered daze. Annalene looked across the table and focused on tiny tears that were escaping the corners of Dwayne's eyes. His eyes were glossed over, shinier than she had ever seen them before. They didn't look real. Her heart pounded in deep thunderous beats like a bass drum echoing inside, shaking the walls. The crazy laughter that filled the room just minutes ago suddenly morphed into panicked fear, consuming terror and anxiety. Annalene couldn't catch her breath as her eyes bounced between Dwayne's, her sisters, and the neighbors who were holding them captive after drugging them. The room's walls felt as if they were moving closer, tightening the space around her and stealing her breath. She felt faint. She needed to throw up, but remembered what her captor had told Claire. Scott's face was zooming in and out of Dwayne's vision. He saw the knife in Scott's hand. The swirls of light and shiny chrome metallic strands danced in front of him in swirling motions like a river of blended substances from another world. The feeling in the pit of his stomach caused an ache that begged to rise and spill from his mouth. His surroundings were like nothing he had seen in all his life. His desire to protect his wife tore at every fiber of his being, yet it mattered not how hard he pulled against the resistance around his wrists. They tightened even more. The ache and burn defeated his ability to win that battle. During all the oddity and horror around him, a smoky gas bubbled up from his stomach. As it escaped in a belch of garbled retch and bile, he was reminded he had eaten a meal consisting of his best friend, Tick. The sick bastard in front of him, darting in and out of the crazy mix of blurred colors, had killed his dog and cooked him, feeding him to us in a meal of Thanksgiving. Who in hell could do that? What had he or Annalene done to deserve such an attack on their family? The chill of the blade's steel tip drug just lightly enough across his throat to send the cold, sharp tingles which begged him to take the action to flinch. His jumbled thoughts were disconnected from his ability to respond. Every emotion and feeling felt foreign, including the saliva in his mouth, which now felt like thick straw, adding to his confused judgments being charred from all the differing senses attacking at once. His vision began to fade, his receptors overtaxed. He called out, "Annalene, I love you. I'm sorry." The familiar sound of something being drug across the back screen door awakened Dwayne from the intoxicated stupor he had fallen into. It couldn't be, though. It sounded like Tick's paws scratching to be let in, a sound both Annalene and he knew well. But he had been told Tick was dead. Worse yet, he had been told he and his family had eaten him. He must be hallucinating. Had Scott lied? Was this some kind of sick joke? The sound of claws dragging down the screen again drew attention. This time the screen door banged a couple of times as if Tick were trying to open it. "Mary, go check out that noise, baby doll. I gotta watch these 4 toys careful-like," Scott snapped out. Mary sauntered by, again looking at Annalene and softly saying, "Oh, do you have an evening of horror ahead of you, Miss Too Good?" And then she laughed as she headed out toward the kitchen and to the back of the house. Annalene looked over at Scott, who still had the knife in his hand close to her husband's throat. "Why? What did we ever—" "Shut up!" Scott yelled. Several moments went by and Scott hollered out towards the back where he had sent his wife. "Mary, what's going on?" There was a clatter and a bang followed by a shrill scream. Mary yelled for help but was quickly muffled by the sound of growls and chewing noises, gurgling and hissing. Scott let the knife down and away from Dwayne's neck. As he began to walk past Dwayne towards the kitchen, there was a low rumble that sounded like a big dog's warning of an impending attack. Scott looked down at Dwayne as it sounded like it was coming from him. Scott leaned over Dwayne's shoulder, and as he did, Dwayne looked up and into Scott's eyes. They locked stares. Dwayne's eyes held the look of a rabid pit bull, and a low grumble was resonating inside his throat. The growl kept drawing on, never changing tone or tempo. It was the kind of rumble that would stop an intruder in their tracks, sensing the impending doom about to occur. Scott's eyes were locked with Dwayne's, but Dwayne's eyes no longer resembled what they were. They weren't blue anymore. Instead, they held a brownish-yellow hue with a sharp, deadly focus within. His eyes looked exactly like Tick's eyes. Scott stood completely still, his legs and hands now trembling as if he knew he was about to meet head-on with a beast hungry with vengeance. The low rumble became louder. The racket in the back room had subsided, leaving only heavy breaths and sighs, soon followed by the pitter-pat of paws getting louder and louder. Scott merely tightened the grip on the blade he held, but it was just enough movement to send the growling beast surging back and up, grabbing Scott by the throat. It wasn't Tick that grabbed him. It was Dwayne's jaws that snapped close and began shaking and pulling like a rabid dog in fight to the death. There were gurgles that came out with Scott's muted cries along with the sound of air hissing in escape from the open wound in his neck. He quickly dropped the knife and fell helpless to his knees, his sheer weight ripping a chunk from his neck away as the grip of Dwayne's snarling mouth held tight. It all happened so quickly that Annalene, Ben, and Claire didn't seem to have time to even conceive what was or had just happened. When Dwayne looked up and over to them from across the table, the mere sight of his bloodied face caused shrieks filled with terror and trepidation at the grotesque sight of what their eyes fell victim of seeing. Horror-struck and shaking in their skin, still unable to do more than tremble and attempt to look away, hoping it was all just a ghastly nightmare. Claire's head dropped with a loud thud to the tabletop, now passed out only inches away from the casserole dish that had begun this grisly drug-induced hell. Annalene sat sobbing uncontrollably, dazed and confused, not knowing if Dwayne was dead or a transformed animal from the depths of the unknown. She was incoherent and lost in the hallucinations still coming on strong in waves from the mushroom concoction Mary had brought. Ben's eyes were open so wide there was bright white that showed completely around his large, still dilated pupils. Tick came trotting in from the kitchen, his once white and black face now covered in crimson red with strands of black hair still clinging to his fangs. Dwayne lifted his head and looked at his faithful dog. "Tick, you saved us, boy. But," Dwayne's eyes scanned the table and saw the tray of meat. He told me he killed you, boy, and cooked you." Tears filled Dwayne's eyes as he hollered out to his wife, "Annalene, sweet potato, baby, are you okay? I love you, girl." It was as if their energy all died in unison. Each of their heads began bobbing, their eyes becoming empty as the adrenaline quickly oozed from their veins. Hands still zip-tied together behind them, one by one their heads dropped until either their chins rested on their chests or their forehead landed on the tabletop. Silence. The sound of a body pulling itself across the floor melded with subtle moans of what sounded like a woman and broke the dead stillness that had encompassed the morbid setting around the Thanksgiving dinner table. Fans cheering at the football game could be heard on the television from the living room. Tick's low, gravelly growl began slow and steady, but was elevating alarm as Mary crawled closer to where Dwayne was motionless, his head on the dinner table, drool spilling from his mouth mixing with blood dripping from a red line across his neck. Mary held a sharp stainless steel carving blade in one hand as she pulled herself closer to the chair holding Dwayne's body. Scott lay next to it, a crumpled pile of flannel and jeans, his head lying a pool of blood. Tick's body stiffened as he watched Mary pull herself closer, one hand gripped the chair leg, the other clutching a knife. Tick's growl increased as Mary pulled herself upright, knife held overhead, readied to plunge into Dwayne's back. Tick charged just as the front door opened. A thunderous bam shattered the quiet as Mary fell backwards onto the floor, blood oozing from the tiny round hole in the center of her forehead. Tick ran up and snapped his jaws at her, but soon sensed no threat in her deathly stillness and sat next to his master's chair he was tied to. The reflection of blue and red lights bounced off the tree limbs that could be seen through the window as it mixed with the changing television tones. Deputy Brown stepped up onto the porch and peered in through the open door at Sheriff Buckner. "What the fuck happened here, Bill?" Sheriff Bill Buckner turned and slowly responded, "God damned if I know. This is a Thanksgiving dinner from hell." Epilogue. Tonight's weather will bring in another cold front from the northwest, dropping temperatures to a subnormal 18 degrees and then warming throughout tomorrow into the upper 30s. In other breaking news, it seems Black Friday came a day early during a Thanksgiving get-together for 4 family members who are in guarded care at Barton County Hospital, recuperating from a holiday gone awry. Sheriff Bill Buckner states that 2 deceased unnamed individuals were neighbors of the recovering victims. As it turns out, the sheriff and his deputies investigating possible drug dealings happened onto a skirmish just in time to avert a possible murder. Police later found an undisclosed amount of drugs and marijuana in the deceased couple's home next door. They also uncovered an illegal psilocybin mushroom farm at the same address's basement. The 4 family members are expected to survive, but were apparently dosed by ingesting a casserole containing a large amount of the mushrooms before being tied up and tortured. One of the 2 suspects was shot and killed by Sheriff Buckner as he came through the door, stumbling onto an attempted murder in progress. The suspect, nor her husband, survived. More details as they are uncovered. We here at Channel 11 hope you've had a wonderful Thanksgiving Day, and remember to show kindness during your Black Friday shopping. Only 28 more shopping days until Christmas.
Why did the garbage men start coming in the dead of night? Does anyone know? I've been losing an average of 30 minutes of sleep every night for the past 10 days. Now I'm down to a paltry 4 hours and 30 minutes. My walls are beginning to shift and my vision is blurring. I have to focus. I need to focus. Someone out there has to know. Does anyone know why the garbage collectors have switched to the night shift? Even asking it sends shivers down my spine. It's late, and soon I'll hear them turn up to collect. I can't sleep upstairs anymore, not where they can see me. Now I sleep in the living room with my gun propped up against my shoulder. The weight, a stern reminder that I am present. I am awake. I am a threat to them. They won't try anything if I'm a threat to them, right? Wait, I'm sorry. Let me explain. My name's Tyson. I'm a farmer with a thriving family, a loving wife, and 2 bright young boys. We live in a very remote area that requires a significant amount of divergence for basic services. I won't say where. I won't risk my family or my business, especially knowing what kind of armchair detectives there are out there. I respect what y'all do and fear you in equal measure. So I'd rather throw you a bone you can thoroughly chew on, as opposed to delving into mine and my family's personal info. What I can tell you is this patch of land has been in my family for 6 generations, was not acquired illegally, built on sacred land, and to the best of my knowledge, has never had a violent occurrence or bloodshed. We're normal, hardworking folk who have always tried to do right, which makes what's going on here all the more difficult to understand, to quantify and reason with when the basic logic gives way. I hear you. You're undoubtedly scratching your heads and asking, why are garbage collectors such an issue? And I don't blame you. I'll get to that. Something shifted by the gates. No sound. Can't be the garbage men. You hear them a mile off. They're not subtle about making their presence known. The first night they turned up was so startling that I honest to God thought we were being robbed by the most unprofessional thieves this part of the world has ever birthed. Rambunctious, loud, and borderline jovial in their candor. It was always the same, each and every time. The sounds of the huge mechanical vehicle roaring as it drove up my dirt road, crushing twigs and kicking up dirt as it ground to a stop by the gates some 50 feet from my front door. 2 thuds, boots hitting the ground, stumbling over to the main gate where our trash was left for the garbage men on a Tuesday. Usually a couple of surly men got out, grunted, and hauled ass out of the area as soon as possible. These 2 couldn't have been happier to be there from the sounds of things. Young men, smiles almost visible in their tone. "This the one, Bill? Looks ready to me." "Reckon it is, Jeff. Let's get her done." A laugh, a high five, the sounds of something being dragged, then thrown into the truck before they'd back out of the driveway and go off into the night. Unusual, right? My wife and kids certainly thought so, especially when the trash was still there the next morning. Maybe there were some weird kids pulling a prank, my wife, Lucy, remarked, taking a sip from her coffee and glancing nervously at the window. I think she was saying it more for our boys' benefit than our own. I nodded and ushered them away from the windows, told them to go play. The next night it happened again. Not at a specific time so much as that dead-of-night period between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. when the world falls totally silent around you. None of our animals made a peep during that time frame, nor did we dare to, because when we heard them roll up again, we were paralyzed with fear. It took a few minutes to realize it, but when I looked to my wife, and she returned my fearful glance with a wide-eyed stare and a nod, we scooped up the boys and huddled in our bed. The exact same sounds, the exact same timed footsteps, the exact same conversation. We heard them drag something wet into the truck before leaving after maybe 15 minutes. My younger boy, Jace, was always anxious, and hearing this uncanny valley stuff at his age sent him into a panic attack. We spent the remaining time soothing him while my older son, Travis, took to peering through the window with me. Our pig pen, that lay some 40 feet to the right of the house, had the door ripped off the hinges and a blood trail leading from the entrance all the way to the farm gates where the garbage men had been. When we mustered up the courage to inspect further, the pigs were silent, unmoving, and staring at the long dirt road that led away from our home. The tall trees that littered our farm were looming overhead as if to silence them from telling what they'd seen. We tried calling the city council to complain, but they were as perplexed as we were, and said trash pickup day was still Tuesday, and that since it was only Sunday, we weren't due. They advised we file a complaint with the police for trespassers, but that yielded absolutely nothing. In the meantime, things escalated. Night 3 brought us the same routine, same sounds. Even after we'd taken to putting a lock on the pig pen, they still took one, this time making sure to leave a small pile of viscera behind, perhaps as a warning. We elected to put the animals in the barn and deadbolt it, hoping the pranksters would get the message and perhaps get bored. I ordered a CCTV camera, but with my location being so out of the way, it was going to take time to arrive, and I wasn't about to stand in my window with a camera pointed out at some weirdos. We didn't consider the consequences of this defiance. It was night 5. The boys were sleeping in our room, and like clockwork, they showed up and pulled me from what little sleep I was getting, my wife soon after. Silently, goosebumps raised on our skin and a chill in our bones. We strained our ears against the open window, hoping to hear their frustration and subsequent decision to leave. The routine continued until Jeff spoke to Bill. The moment they opened their mouths, I knew something was horribly wrong. "This the one, Bill? Looks locked to me. I reckon it is, Jeff. Let's pay him a visit. They rattled our front doorknob and politely knocked on the door. 5 rhythmic knocks, 5 seconds of silence, 5 more aggressive knocks. I bolted downstairs and grabbed my rifle, keeping the lights off, but my aim was focused on them. Adrenaline pushed fear aside, if only to defend my family. I don't know who you are, but you've been coming onto my property unannounced, and I ain't standing for it no more. I pulled back on the bolt, and the sound filled the room. You got 3 seconds to turn in your heel, or I'm firing. My eyes adjusted to the front door, and in the darkness, 2 shapes stood behind my door, shrouded by the shadow of the night. They were tall, with thin legs and bizarre movements, like they were swaying in place. Those 3 seconds felt like an eternity. 1. The shadow to the front leaned forward, trying to press its face against the glass. Something was wrong. 2. It moved away and trapped the letterbox, testing if it opened up. When it did, it held it open and spoke as the second shadow stepped closer. 3 never came. Instead, I backed away out of terror and barricaded our room, unable to speak. It repeated my last words back at me, exact same pitch, exact same tone. But something was off about it. Like hearing your own voice played back through old speakers. You sense an eeriness to it. As I'd instinctively taken steps back, however, the other one spoke. This was the first time either said anything that didn't repeat, and I swear to God it makes my heart pound in my throat just typing it. "We've come to collect. Come outside." My legs carried my body before I could register what was going on. Rushing to the bedroom and locking it, I pulled my family in close and held my head down to theirs, desperate to block out whatever ungodly sounds erupted from our front door. It took a half hour before they gave up, assumed their usual routine, and left, the sound of the tires speeding off up the road bringing some degree of relief. Until the following morning, when our nearest neighbors, the Gundersons, reported a break-in at their farm some 5 miles up the road. The perpetrators had smashed through the gate, entered the barn, and done such violent acts to their cattle that of the 10 that had been attacked and mutilated, only 2 survived and were immediately put out of their misery by the patriarch, Ted. "You've been having problems with these sons of bitches too, Ty?" he bellowed down the phone once I began retailing our sleepless events. "You sound like hell and probably look worse than the cows at this point. I ain't having it. You got a young family to support, and when they hurt one of us, they hurt all of us. Tonight we put an end to it, you hear?" I nodded, agreeing to stake out our property that night and do whatever needed to be done. Hands still shaking, I grabbed a stiff drink from the cabinet. Never been much of a drinker. Most of this was my dad's for the tougher times. But if times weren't tough now, I don't know when they would be. Ted rolled up around 11 p.m. The wife and kids were asleep, and we talked in the living room for a while, mainly discussing how the harvest had gone and what we could do to protect our livelihoods in this day and age. The conversation petered off, as they often do, when a night draws on, but it was as if we fell silent that the realization swept over us. We were going to confront these people tonight. I gripped my gun a little tighter as Ted gave me an assuring nod, peeking out the window for any signs of the garbage man. "Son of a... my farm," he bellowed, springing to his feet and bursting out the door before I could get a word in edgewise. He was halfway down the road before I could ask him what he was doing. He turned, his eyes wild with fear and rage, pointing a shaking finger to the small shape that was his house far across the hill. It was on fire, large pillars of smoke billowing forth as the fire danced in the light, illuminating the surrounding fields. "I can't sit here while my livelihood burns away, Ty. If those bastards are behind this, well, you can bet your ass they won't last the night when I'm through with them. I'll teach them a lesson about the value of things. The things people throw away. He turned on his heel and ran to his truck, speeding off before anything more could be said. This would be the only night the garbage men didn't pay us a visit. I got a bit of extra sleep, but my wife didn't. She just stared out the window at the Gundersons' farm in the distance and shook her head. She knew how there'd be no help on the horizon. She knew how close we are to that fate, and seeing that scares me to death. The 8th night. They arrived with no sound of vehicles, no grand build-up to the crescendo of their routine. They whistled softly, as if calling an animal, patient in their calls as they scraped something around in the dirt. I was crippled by fear and could not dream of facing them. I looked around in the dark and saw my wife was still asleep, my eldest snoring in the corner. But my youngest was wide awake and transfixed, and staring at the window outlooking our driveway, reaching out to open it. I leaped out of the bed and was just about to tackle him away. The shock of such a violent affair sent him into a panic attack as the entire family snapped awake in a frenzy, shouting over one another as he cried uncontrollably. "This has got to stop, Tyson. We can't do this anymore. We can't live like this." Lucy was exhausted, her eyes barely open and her teeth chattering. In the moment of silence between us, the whistling started again, almost mocking in its turn if it weren't for the sinister giggling behind it. "Shut up! Shut up and leave us alone!" she screamed, walking toward that same window. It took everything I had to hold her back as she fell to pieces in my arms. My entire family crippled by nerves and a lack of sleep. It was only when one voice cut the air that the final night's events were set in motion. The things people throw away. Oh no, Ted. One look into my wife's eyes and I knew what she was thinking. There was no stopping her. She darted around, packing the kids' clothes and any essentials she could find, ignoring the whistling outside and instructing our boys to focus on getting whatever they needed. "You do what you need to do. I don't care if the nearest town is a 3-hour drive or I undergo the 7-hour drive to my mom's. I will not stay another night in this house. Not until they're gone." She was almost delirious, fueled by fear and anger, as she darted around like a hurricane, turning over tables to get what she needed, as if prepping for a weather event. Within the half hour she'd been rushing around, the noises had faded and the outside once again fell silent. I couldn't leave the house. It had been our family's lineage for generations. We'd been born here, lived here, and died here no matter what. As the head of the family, it was my job to stay here and protect it, even if I couldn't protect those I loved most under its roof. She waited another hour before getting in the car and leaving, kissing me with all the passion she had when we first met. I told Jace he had to be strong and that he'd one day conquer his fears because I believed in him. I told Travis that, as the eldest, he needed to protect them like his life depended on it. Then, just like that, I waved them goodbye and promised I'd join them at their mother-in-law's when this was over. Now, all that was left was to sharpen my resolve and find out what this was. I took the chance to try and get some sleep during the day, but no matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't come to me. So, liquid courage it was, one way or another. This was going to end. Night 9, the penultimate night. Not a sound. I mean that in the most literal sense. The wind didn't move, the trees didn't speak, not a single blade of grass danced, and no dirt was kicked up. Everything was silent, so silent. My own thoughts were amplified in this void of sound. Every inane thought of what could happen flitted through my mind and forced me to double-check every window and door, triple-check the locks, ensure no oversight was left. Couldn't let them get an opportunity. Even if it was just me, I knew they were watching even now. If I hadn't known any better, I'd have said a shadow moved just beyond the porch window. Couldn't be sure, not without checking. I thought they were biding their time, keeping me on edge, and making sure I knew they could step in whenever they wanted and do as they pleased. But I kept my nerve. I resisted the urge to bolt to the truck. I had my whiskey and I had my gun. I'd see this through, even if it killed me. Night 10. Now we're all caught up. I checked on the animals this morning. What was left was a pile of bones, flesh, and waste. They'd been taken the night before, and I don't know how I didn't hear during the silence. There was but one horse's body left, teeth, marks, riddled the torso, and the legs had been torn off. Our crops had grown fetid, decayed, and worn. Nothing in our farm would yield a damn thing anymore. My livelihood was decimated in front of my eyes. Gone. It's light now. I'm sitting in my armchair with a rifle loaded and ready. My hands are shaking, and my knee won't stop bouncing. I feel the dread start in my gut and worm its way through my chest before lodging in my throat and forcing every breath to be a labor of pain. They come early tonight, truck roaring and routine sounds in full swing. Only there aren't 2 sets of thuds this time. There are 6. They walk up to the porch, a shadow covering every facet of the window and door panes. Not a speck of light coming through. The voices don't change their pattern. They never do. "This the one, Bill? Looks ready to me." They pound their fists against the window, a dull moan emanating from the background, pained, muffled, and growing in strength. "I reckon it is, Jeff. Let's get her done." Nails drag down the glass. A horrific moaning accompanies the repeated intonations of the God-forsaken phrases. "These things people throw away." Ted. Poor Ted, smashing his head against the wall, repeating it with every sick swing. It was only when I heard the 4th voice that finally I looked out at the window, perhaps on instinct. Not until they're gone. My Lucy. My sweet Lucy calling to me. I can't begin to tell you what I saw when I pulled back the curtains for just a split second. But every forbidden aspect of it is burned into my brain, and it will not leave me even as I shut my eyes from the surrounding chorus of madness. My kids, my own kids, are now saying they've come to collect, that I must come outside. That whistle has come back. It's almost soothing. I can't bear to do this on my own. I can't live with that image in my skull anymore. I miss my wife. I miss my kids. I miss sleeping soundly at night. What if it's them out there? What if they really just want me to get help? And my own sick mind has put me in such a state that I'm here, asking you for help on something that is, at its core, truly simple? I'm going to put down the laptop and open the door. I have to know. I have to. Why did the garbage men start coming in the dead of night? Does anyone know?
Hello. This is part 3 of the Watchmaster trilogy, written by the exceptionally talented Micah Edwards. The entire trilogy was narrated, produced, and brought to you by my son, Justin. He voiced every character, as well as composing and performing all of the original music contained within these stories. Okay, we do suggest that you listen to the first 2 installments before listening to this story, in order to have context for the events that are about to take place. Please listen to episode 190, The Watchmaster. Then following that, you should listen to the episode titled What Was Lost. Then lastly, this story that is currently playing. Links in the description below. Thank you to all the listeners of Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. Now enjoy the show.
Have you ever seen such a pretty face? There was a time, just a few short months ago, that Richard had enjoyed his Saturday nights. They had been a time to unwind, to put down the pens and ledgers of work and enjoy the company of friends. He regretted now that he had not appreciated them appropriately. He had looked around his comfortable pub, his familiar friends, his simple pleasures, and found them to be insufficient. He had cast his gaze lustfully at the grand parties of the upper class, jealous of their lavish houses and endless funds. He had wished that he could walk among them. Montfort had granted him that wish. He had unlocked the door and ushered Richard into the social life he had admired from afar. By the time Richard realized it was a trap, it was far too late. He was caught as neatly as any animal in the woods. And like the animals, Richard would gladly have sacrificed his own leg to escape, if only this trap would allow him to break free so easily. The day the trap was sprung had been a day like any other. Richard was walking to his work at the Royal Exchange, his mind already skipping past the duties of the day to consider the evening ahead. He was resigned to another Saturday of drinking, skittles, and watching fights, followed by a hungover Sunday morning, regretting his decisions in church. He had the option not to go out, of course. But then what was he to do? Sit at home? He longed for something different, but he saw no way in which anything could change. Had the day been a bit foggier, had Richard's mind been a bit more preoccupied, had 1,000 other small things been the slightest bit different, Richard might have ended up in the pub that night. He might have walked past the snare, never knowing how close he had come, leaving it for some other unwary passerby. But things were as they were, and Richard was the unlucky target. It was the name on the shop that caught Richard's eye, a rare ray of morning sun glinting off the bold golden script. Montfort. The store bore no other decoration, no sign or logo. The windows were frosted glass, flaunting the lack of information about the contents or purpose of the space within. Curiosity seized Richard. He had to know what sort of store this was. He opened the door and stepped inside. It was dimmer in the shop than on the street, and cooler as well. All around was the steady, reverberating tick, a constant beat out of the darkness. In the moment before Richard's eyes adjusted, he half wondered if he had walked into the chest of some gigantic automaton. Surrounded by the tick, he felt as if he were in the middle of a mechanical heart. A lamp on the far wall sputtered to life, lit by a lanky, neatly attired man. Quite early for customers. I am Montfort, and I will be with you shortly. Pardon me as I prepare the shop for the day. Oh, not at all. I was just wondering what you sold here. He felt foolish as soon as the words left his mouth. Even in the insufficient light of the windows and the single lamp, it was clear that Montfort sold clocks and watches. They stood in corners, glittered under displays, and studded the walls. They were the source of the heavy, insistent tick. Standing in the center of it, Richard was amazed that he hadn't been able to hear them from outside. "Timepieces for the discerning gentleman," said Montfort as he continued to light the shop. His eyes flickered up and down behind his gold-rimmed spectacles, taking Richard's measure. Richard was certain that he came up wanting. His suit was serviceable enough for work, but out of fashion and worn at the edges. His hair was in need of a trim. He looked, in short, like what he was, a civil servant getting by as best he could. Richard liked to believe that he was doing all right in the world, but he could not trick himself into believing that he belonged in the sort of store that identified itself by a single word and did not advertise in the windows. He did not know what he had been thinking coming in here in the first place. He was not particularly discerning, and he was definitely not a gentleman. "A lovely boutique," said Richard. He turned for the door, eager to make his escape before he embarrassed himself further. "Thank you for satisfying my curiosity." "Wait. Let me show you my selection. Perhaps we can find a watch to complement your enterprising spirit." "I think the price—" Richard began, but Montfort beckoned him over with a confident gesture. "Please, indulge me. I have no other customers at the moment, and I do love discussing my work. Besides, as a financier, perhaps." "Only scrivener." "Still, a man with upward aspirations, and a well placed to do something about them. I think we may be able to come to an agreement. I prefer my work to be out in the world. A watch sitting in a shop surrounded by others of its ilk is worth nothing at all. It must stand alone in order to have value." Richard walked slowly toward Montfort, drawn by the man's inviting tone and the gleaming glass case before him. The watches within sat on a bed of black velvet and shone like stars in the night sky. Some were simple silver affairs, while others were ornately carved and inlaid with gems. Everyone was unique, and everyone was a work of art. "I really don't think I'll be able to," he began again, but Montfort was already drawing one watch from the case. "I think this would be suitable for a man of your ambitions," said Montfort, holding it out. Richard reached for it automatically, afraid of compounding his airs through rudeness. The watch fit into the palm of his hand as if it had been designed for it. It nestled perfectly in the cupped hollow, with the spring release for the cover brushing gently against the base of Richard's little finger. The slightest squeeze and it sprang open, revealing a marvel in silver and moonstone. The hands clicked gently through the bases, marking out the seconds with precision and art. The interior of the lid caught the light and focused it onto the watch face, making the whole thing seem to glow. It exuded style and class. It looked like the future. With a terrible effort, Richard tore his eyes away and closed the lid. He handed the watch back to Montfort. "An incredible piece of work. You have an amazing talent." To his surprise, Montfort did not extend his own hand to receive the watch. He merely inclined his head, accepting the praise. "And for such a watch, would you be able to pay, per fortnight, shall we say?" "I mean, surely it would take me forever to pay for this in fortnightly installments." Montfort waved his objection away. "Let that be my concern. The watch suits you. I would like to see it leave with you. What could you take from your paycheck without damage to your finances?" Richard tethered momentarily, then named a number that was slightly more than he could truly afford. Even so, he was certain Montfort would consider it to be insultingly low. He was shocked when the man paused, then nodded. "I can accept that if you will add one additional piece, a less tangible form of payment, but no less important. If you will usher new custom my way, if you can direct one new customer to me per fortnight, then we have a deal." Richard winced, reluctant to lose the watch, but was driven by honesty. "I doubt I know anyone who could properly afford your wares." Montfort smiled. "Perhaps the watch will bring you luck in that regard. Your part is to send me one new customer every 2 weeks, along with the rest of your payment. as to whether they are suitable. Again, that'd be my concern. He reached beneath the counter and withdrew a pre-written contract, into which he filled the terms in which they had agreed. He passed it over to Richard, who wrote his name into the buyer's blank and signed it at the bottom. "Carry your watch in health, Mr. Griffiths," said Montford, signing his own name in the space for the proprietor. "I look forward to a long and profitable relationship between us." Richard opened his new watch to admire the craftsmanship once more. As he did so, every watch and clock in the store struck the hour at once. Each chime was different, but all were perfectly synchronized. The silence between the sounds was almost palpable. It was less mocking of a time than it was a summons to something greater than the world Richard had known. The last chime died away. Reality reasserted itself. Richard suddenly realized that he was now late for work. I'm sorry, I have to go. I'll see you in 2 weeks, Mr. Griffiths. Richard was still clutching his watch when he rushed into the exchange. One of the financiers for whom he distantly worked, an older man named Joseph Ferguson, called out to him on the way in. "Running a bit late, man." "Sorry, sir." "Isn't that a watch in your hand? It tells the time, doesn't it?" "It does." Richard held it out apologetically. The cover flipped open as he did so. The watch sparkled brilliantly, throwing fractured glints of sunlight around the room. "I say, quite the piece you have there." "It's from a shop called Montford, just down the road." Richard remembered the second half of his deal for the watch. "I'd be happy to show you if you like. Later, I mean." "Not generally my thing. Watches. The church bells do fine for me. Still..." Joseph's eyes seemed fixed to the watch. He pulled himself away with a visible shake of his head. "I know a man who'd love to see such a piece. Don't suppose you'd be willing to loan it out?" Richard hesitated, and Joseph laughed. "I won't make you say no to me, man. How's this, then? Albert's having a gathering tonight. I'll take you as my guest, if you'll take that watch as yours. Never hurts to be the man who's found the newest thing." He eyed Richard judgmentally. "Don't suppose you have a better suit? Well, you're about my son's size. He has more than he knows what to do with. With that watch and better clothes, you'll fit in fine." Joseph clapped him on the back and was gone before Richard could really react. The day passed in odd fits and starts. Richard would check his watch, certain that it had been hours, only to find that less than 10 minutes had gone by since he last looked at it. Then suddenly an hour would slip by unnoticed. He daydreamed about the upcoming party, but wasn't fully convinced that the invitation had been real until the end of the day, when Joseph brought him the promised suit. It was a nearly perfect fit and far nicer than anything Richard had previously owned. To his delight, Richard found that he fit into the party as well as he had into the suit. Joseph introduced him to Albert, who, as promised, was extremely taken with the watch. He eagerly accepted Richard's offer of an introduction with Montford. The evening passed in a whirlwind of sumptuous food and enough drink to ensure that any conversation seemed scintillating. Richard returned home exhausted and thrilled, and even though the following day's hangover was enough to make him skip church entirely, he regretted nothing. The social stratum above him was everything he imagined it was, and he had finally been allowed to access it. On Monday evening, Richard brought Albert to Montford's shop, proud to be producing his first payment with such rapidity. "I'll have the money for you as well by the end of the week," he told Montford while Albert was engrossed in the watches. "I'm certain you will. You seem a man aware of the value of punctuality, and thank you for this introduction. I believe he and I will be able to come to an accord." Albert, having obtained his own Montford watch, had no further need of Richard. Joseph still knew of other engagements where he would be welcomed as an exciting new distraction. However, Over the course of the next few weeks, Richard met several more gentlemen at various parties who were eager to show him off, and his social circle rapidly grew. He ransacked his savings and bought several new suits, anxious not to let his patrons down. Richard had initially worried that he might be unable to find new customers for Montford. He quickly discovered this was unlikely to be a problem. Gentlemen interested in being on the cutting edge of accessories were thick on the ground. His funds, however, less so. At the end of the first month, Richard found himself just short of the payment he had promised to Montford. He gathered together what he could and brought it by, telling himself that Montford would be understanding. He had brought the shop far more than the promised 2 customers after all. There would be room for leeway. Montford was a gentleman. "I see," said Montford when Richard had explained the situation. He accepted the offered coin pouch. "This is unfortunate. But of course, we cannot always control our circumstances. On this occasion, I am inclined to be generous." "Thank you. I promise it won't happen again." "I will hold you to that promise." Montford delivered the sentence lightly, but his eyes were intense. "In fact, I believe I may be able to assist you with keeping it, if you would not take such a gift amiss." "No, of course. I would be in your debt." Just so. Montford held Richard in his gaze for precisely 1 second longer than was comfortable. The tick of the shop felt like a physical bond. "You may expect it at your place of residence tomorrow." Richard thanked him again and turned to leave. Montford's voice arrested him just as he was reaching for the door. "Mr. Griffiths, please do not allow word of my generosity to get out. I am running a business here after all. I cannot make such exceptions for everyone." Montford's tone seemed slightly more ominous than the words implied. Richard puzzled over it on the way to work, but the demands of work quickly drove such idle conversations from his head. The senior scrivener, Thomas, did not show up for work that day, which meant that Richard and his fellows were forced to pick up his share of the tasks. By the end of the day, he had no mental energy left to worry about what Montford might have meant. The next day, Thomas remained absent, and work was more of the same. Richard dragged himself home afterward, intending only to eat his supper and retire to an early bed, but was surprised to find a delivery man waiting for him at his lodging. "From Montford," said the man, pressing a parcel the size of a hat box into Richard's hands. He scuttled off into the evening as soon as the box had left his hands. The box was far too large to contain a watch. It was oddly warm to the touch, though Richard put that down to an overzealous grasp by the delivery man. Curious what Montford might have sent him, Richard opened the box as soon as he was inside. He saw made him stumble back in fear, shouting aloud. The box contained a clock as interpreted by a charnel house. The hands were thin slivers of bone. The lettering on the dial was inscribed into small ivory slabs that looked to have been cut from teeth. The face was the most horrifying part. It was a literal face, sliced free from the man whom it had belonged, and stretched taut to hide the clockwork from view. Worse, Richard recognized the face. It was the missing scrivener, Thomas. A sudden knock at the door caused Richard to yelp in surprise again. In a moment, Griffiths. It was the lodger down the hall, Lawrence. You're right there. Wildly, Richard looked around. He couldn't be seen with the gruesome clock. Montford's warning about not letting his generosity be known leapt into sudden, horrifying focus. He had killed Thomas as a warning. He would kill Richard just as easily. Griffiths! Richard threw his coat over the box and hastily opened the door a crack. Yes, sorry. I just shouted. Everything all right? Yes. I thought I saw a rat. Rats? We paid too much for that sort of thing. We'll have to have a talk with the landlady. Visions of her insisting on searching his apartment and finding Montford's terrible clock leapt into Richard's mind. No. It's fine. I only thought I saw one. Turned out to be just a shadow. Long day, you know. Mine's playing tricks on me. I see. Lawrence looked unconvinced. He peered over Richard's shoulder as if looking for a rat to prove the lie. Richard was thankful he had covered the clock. Well, try to keep it down, would you? Of course. Richard closed the door. His heart was hammering. He reluctantly returned his attention to Montford's gift. Thomas's face stared back at him in a frozen expression of horror. Gears turned behind his empty eyes. His mouth was open in a thin slit. The die was marked not with numbers, but with letters. They did not follow any pattern that Richard understood until he realized that there were 14 of them, not 12. They were the days of the week, pacing out a fortnight. The hunt was currently most of the way to the first Wednesday. The hunt pointed straight up. Instead of ending in an arrow, the hunt terminated in a round silver disc. To Richard's horror, he realized that Thomas's parted lips were the right size to accept coins. He tentatively deposited a shilling. The hunt moved smoothly forward a small amount. Richard had no doubt that if he calculated the distance it had traveled, he would find that it marked off exactly 1 shilling's worth of his fortnightly payment to Montford. The money was stored in a small detachable bag of pale leather, cunningly concealed in the bottom of the clock. The material was soft, supple, and the same shade as the face of the clock. Richard did his best not to think what it was made of as he touched it. When he removed it from the clock, the coin hand reset to 0. The hand marking the days continued its inexorable march forward. The tick of the clock sounded like a heartbeat, counting out the remaining hours of Richard's life. It was perfectly in sync with the tick of the watch in his pocket. Richard hid the clock in the cupboard, but his dreams that night were haunted by Thomas's staring face and the constant, inescapable tick. He was trapped by Montford's creations. Next morning, Richard charged into Montford's shop, the watch already in his hand. Montford's back was to the door, yet he spoke before Richard could even utter his first word. It is possible that you have come here today to attempt to return my watch and break our contract. Know that I would consider this an extremely grave insult. I will instead therefore assume that having received my kind gift, you have come to express your appreciation for my assistance in keeping to your word. If that is all, consider it said. Richard turned and left without a word. The week ground on. The distance between the time and going ons on Montford's clock grew even wider. When Richard received his pay at the end of the week, he forced almost every coin into the hoard receptacle, desperate to see progress being made. He stayed at home that weekend, shunning both pubs and parties. He did not attend church on Sunday, afraid of the talk if he was seen not to tithe. He could not afford to. He had not even set aside enough money to eat. On Monday, Joseph took him aside at work. Richard was certain the quality of his work had slipped, and he was about to be reprimanded. Perhaps he would even lose his job. He had no idea what to do if that happened. He could not disappoint Montford. He prepared to throw himself on Joseph's mercy.
How would you like to be the senior scrivener?
Richard stared, mouth agape. This was not the conversation he had expected.
I can understand how this might feel like stealing from Thomas, but it's been a week. The man's abandoned us. It is right, of course, but we can't go on a man down for much longer. I see what it's doing to all of you. You look harried, man. Positively unwell.
Richard still said nothing. Joseph pressed on.
You'll oversee the others' work in addition to your own, with a particular eye on whichever new man we pick to fill your old spot. It's an extra half-crown a day. What do you say to that?
Thomas's stretched face with its thin, hungry mouth swam into Richard's mind. An extra half-crown would go far toward feeding those demanding lips. He said yes.
Good man. Good man. I imagine you've been having quiet evenings this week to recover from all the work we've dumped on you. But can I talk you into another gathering this Sunday? Oscar's taking up some foreign dignitaries he's invited in, and I'd love to show him up with that Montford piece you have.
Richard started to shake his head until he realized that he had not brought anyone to Montford's shop in the last 2 weeks. His payment was due on Monday, and the desperately hoarded coins were only half of it. He did not dare disappoint Montford again. He forced a smile to his face.
I'd be delighted. Excellent. Well, back to work with you, man. There's bills to be paid after all.
Richard needed no reminding of that fact. The tick of the watch in his pocket taunted him with it with every passing second. He wanted to smash it, to throw it into the river, anything to never hear that sound again. But he knew that without it, the invitations to the parties would dry up. His access to potential customers for Montford would cease, and Montford, having already been generous once, certainly would not be again. Once Richard had spent his Saturdays in crowded pubs, wishing he could break into the parties of the wealthy and the elite. Now he spent every weekend among them, collecting names to pay his debt and wishing for nothing more than to once again be a nobody in a pub. Every visit to Montford with a socialite in tow bought Richard another few days of relief. He did not stop to wonder what happened to those he introduced. He just kept searching for the next willing victim, the next sacrifice that would briefly reset the ravenous clock ticking away his mortality. For the most part, he never heard the fate of the new customers he introduced to Montford. He was grateful for those. He could tell himself that they had simply bought a watch and moved on with their lives. They were fine watches, after all. He was not always so lucky. Some, like the gruesome death of the socialite Charles Walker Woods, made the papers. It was the talk of all the parties as well. There were many theories as to what had happened, but no one knew for sure. No one except Richard, and of course Montford himself. Richard had never asked Montford how long until the contract was paid off. He knew now that was a critical mistake, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life.
Well, Mike, you ready? I asked.
Hell yeah. I've been looking forward to this all year,
Mike replied. Let's get this car loaded up and we'll head out. The luggage was plentiful. We had to play a game of Tetris to fit it all into my small SUV. There were tents, cast iron cookware sets, and not to mention several cookers full of food and drink for the weekend. Well, that's all she wrote. Let's hit the road, I said as I placed the last item into the vehicle and closed the hatch. I backed out of the driveway and started our journey to the state park. Upon arrival, I drove the vehicle out onto the field and rolled up as close to the camping area as we could get. The camping area was embedded amongst heavy woodland with various camping lots cleared out.
Looks like we're the first people here,
Mike said. Well, at least we get first pick for our camping spot, I stated. Mike and I proceeded to climb out of the car, walk down the narrow trail to select our camp. We walked for a few minutes when I spotted a nice shady spot encompassed by large trees, an old fire pit, and it was about 10 feet or so from the main trail, just enough for it to feel somewhat secluded. I think this will be the spot, Mike, I said.
Works for me.
We walked back to our SUV and started to unload our gear. After several trips back and forth, the small SUV was unloaded, and we began to set up our individual canvas tents. A few hours passed by, and we finally had the camp fully set up. Hey, Mike, if you want to start on the fire, I'll take the car back to the parking area.
Sounds good, man,
Mike replied. I walked back to the car and drove it back out of the park and around the backside of a large metal building just outside the park entrance. The cars are supposed to be out of sight for all reenactment participants to give the illusion of full immersion into the 18th century. With the car now parked, I started my trek back to the campsite on foot. Arriving back at camp, Mike had a decently steady fire going and was in the process of setting up a couple of gridirons on which to cook our dinner.
Well, what's it going to be tonight? Chicken legs or pork chops?
Mike asked. Let's do the chicken, I replied. Mike dug through the cooler and pulled out a pack of 6 chicken legs. The smell of the chicken roasting over the fire was heavenly. As the chicken was cooking, Mike brought out a tankard of his homemade mead. I grabbed my tin cup and held it out, allowing Mike to fill it to the brim. We drank and held conversation until the chicken was done. We feasted on the chicken, and soon enough the dwindling light of dusk was upon us. Mike and I were finishing up our cups of mead as we watched fellow reenactors finish setting up camp. By the time the others had finished setting up, the only light around were from the moon, stars, and the small campfire before us. Well, I think I'm going to hit the sack, I told Mike.
Probably a good idea,
Mike replied. With that being said, I climbed into my tent, shut the flaps, and soon fell asleep. The morning came swiftly, opening my eyes to the shining sun and birdsong. I heard noises just outside of my tent. Slowly sitting up and stretching, I stood up and proceeded to put my colonial period outfit on. Brown breeches, wool gray stockings, buckled shoes, a white linen shirt, and a traditional tricorn hat. I stepped out of the tent and found Mike already cooking up breakfast consisting of bacon and eggs over the fire. Morning, I said groggily.
Morning,
Mike replied. I noticed that my mouth was particularly dry, so I grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler. That's better, I stated after taking a long drink from the water bottle. I walked over to the fire, grabbing my wooden plate and 2-pronged fork along the way.
Good timing. Food's ready,
Mike said. Awesome. I'm starving. I reached down and grabbed 3 strips of bacon and 2 sunny-side-up eggs.
Well, today is going to be good, but tomorrow will be even better,
Mike said. He was correct. Fridays at this reenactment were called Education Days. It is for the school-age children to come and learn about life in the 18th century. Now, I have to tell you that in the center of this park there's a fort with a period-correct cabin nestled inside. Mike and I were slated with teaching the kids how to properly harvest logs from the woodland as a living exhibit. To start, since it's a state park, we have to select trees that have already fallen to the ground. We cannot cut down fresh trees in order to preserve the natural forest around us. Mike and I ventured into the woodland where we found 3 or 4 trees on the ground which were suitable for log making. With a series of ropes and smaller roller branches, we dragged one tree back to the fort area. I then walked back to camp and retrieved various tools such as draw knives, adzes, axes, wooden mallets, and saws. Soon after returning with the tools, we heard the artillery cannon fire, signaling the opening of the fair.
Slowly, groups of children and teachers were swarming each vendor and exhibit. Mike and I started prepping the first log for lumber harvesting. This was not easy work. It could take up to an hour to harvest only a few pieces of lumber from one log. I continued working on the log as Mike explained the history and the tools that I was using. After a couple of hours, it was lunch break. Mike and I paused our work and set up ropes so the children could not access our exhibit for safety reasons. We walked over to one of the many tents that sold period-correct foods. We selected a tent that was selling green beans and turkey legs. While feasting on our lunch, we sat back in a small shady alcove away from the bustling school children. Mike knew considerably more than me about the immediate area. You know, this area was once inhabited by the Shawnee Native Americans. Oh, yeah? Yeah, I have a fair amount of Native American ancestry in my bloodline.
Well, that's pretty cool, I replied.
My father told me some stories about this area that he stumbled upon while researching our family history. He told me that our people found this land to have mystical properties.
Oh, really? Like what? I asked while taking a large bite out of my turkey leg.
Well, the Kispoko tribe, a sect of the Shawnee, stated they felt the power of the earth no matter where they were in these woodlands. They claimed that their crops always did well and that the water supply never dwindled.
Well, that's pretty interesting.
My father also told me that the Kispoko said that when they drank out of the spring, they felt stronger somehow. Now, the spring has been capped off in recent years, but it still produces fresh water,
Mike added. They must have had a pretty decent life here then.
Well, until the settlers showed up, that is. You see, the settlers had heard of this sacred land and wanted it for themselves to cultivate crops and establish a settlement. So when the settlers came, the natives were pushed out. The few who fought back were either taken prisoner or killed.
Damn, there are a lot of things about history that absolutely disgust me, I replied.
Yeah, well, there's not much we can do about it now.
That's true. The rest of our lunch break, Mike and I sat in silence until we had finished our food. You ready to get back at it?
As ready as I'll ever be.
We walked back over to our exhibit and started harvesting more lumber. The remainder of the day went by fairly quickly. Mike and I took several alternating breaks and taught a few more lessons. Then, before we knew it, the closing of the day was soon upon us. Once the last of the school children were out of the park and the gates were closed, Mike and I started gathering our tools. We headed back to our campsite and put our tools away for the evening. The evenings during the fair consisted of a period-correct dinner. The gathering house was lit with a fire in the hearth and many beeswax candles. We feasted on foods left over from the day. The mead and beer flowed abundantly. Participants of the fair enjoyed this evening time up to 9 p.m., lights out time. After having had consumed copious amounts of beer and mead, Mike and I stumbled our way back to the camp. Upon arrival to camp, I pulled the last 2 bottles of water from the cooler and handed one to Mike.
Thanks, man,
Mike said while reaching for the bottle. No problem. We're going to need it, I said. Mike chuckled slightly and said goodnight and climbed into his tent. I was not extremely tired yet, so I rekindled the low-burning embers in the fire pit into a small fire. I sat by this fire listening to the crickets and the wind blowing through the trees. My mind soon flashed back to the story that Mike had told me, and I pondered on that for a while. I thought of the mystical energy surrounding these lands and felt a slight breeze come through the camp. I shuddered a bit due to the cool nature of the breeze. I then decided to stamp out the fire and turn in for the night. Sun bursting once again through the small gaps in my canvas tent. I awoke to the sound of conversation outside my tent. I once again dressed in full garb and exited my tent to greet the day. Mike and another fellow reenactor were talking near the fire. "Morning, gents," I said as I crouched and warmed my hands by the fire.
"Good morning,"
Mike and the other gentleman replied. "What's on the menu this morning, Mike?"
I figured we'd go into the fair here and get a couple Scotch eggs, Mike replied. Sounds good to me. The fellow reenactor, later come to be known as Charlie, bid his farewell as Mike and I started heading for the Scotch egg booth. Scotch eggs are delicious. What is not to like better than a hard-boiled egg wrapped in pork sausage and fried, slathered with fresh-made stone-ground mustard? Mike and I received our eggs and sat on a bench near the booth to enjoy the delectable morsels of food. Upon finishing our food, we once again heard the artillery cannon blast. Well, here we go. Mike and I slowly stood up and started walking around the outer perimeter of the park, preparing for the onslaught of visitors for the day. For the 2 days remaining at the fair, I was selected to be an actor in a ball of deer. Mike was an actor. We both had to immerse ourselves in the language and actions of someone in the 18th century. We walked up to one of the many taverns to fill our cups with beer. Mike and I walked around for a little while and split up after about half an hour. I set up my tip jar at one of the taverns, set up my lute guitar, and started playing songs of the period. The song Wild Rover was a particular favorite throughout the guests, and each tavern I set up at throughout the day somehow inevitably requested that song. It was around noon when Mike and I met up again atop the hill in the far back of the fair. Now, after several cups of beer, I thought it would be wise to switch to water. Remembering that Mike and I had drank the last of ours, I was going to have to go on a small search for water. Hey, Mike, I'm going to go see if I can find some water. I'll be back in a few. Would you mind watching my things?
Yeah, sure, no problem. I'll be here,
Mike replied. I started to walk a little ways down the hill and saw 2 reenactors drinking water from their cups. I approached and introduced myself. Good day, sirs. I was curious as to where you had found your water.
Good day. My name is Todd and this is James. You must be new around here. You'll have to walk up this trail. There's a fresh natural spring up there. If you'd like to follow us, we were just about to head back up and get more,
one of them said in a rather genuine English accent. Spring? I thought the spring was capped off, I asked, sounding puzzled.
Come, sir, 'tis right this way,
James said. The 2 men started their way up the old dirt trail. I followed. I noticed that the men were talking about events that happened in the late 18th century, as if they were talking about current events. Man, these guys are really dedicated to the bit, I remember thinking to myself. We walked for about 10 minutes or so when we came upon a small stone well at the top of a hill. I looked down the shallow well, and indeed there was a fresh stream of water trickling into the well.
Guys, I thought this was supposed to be capped off,
I said in a concerned tone.
Nay, this well is the source of all our water, crops and drinking alike. Just drop your cup into the well and drink plentifully.
I did as instructed and dipped my cup into the spring. I lifted the cup to my nose, smelling for any foul odor. The smell was of pure spring water. I did not see any sediment or anything in the cup, so I took a swig of it. The water was cool and had a distinct alkaline taste, pure and crisp.
Long travel, sir?
James asked. No, not really. Only about a 10-mile journey from home, I replied. The 2 men looked at each other and Todd scoffed.
10 miles? That's quite a ways.
Not really. Only takes about 10 minutes to get here. Todd and James once again looked at each other with a puzzled expression. I couldn't help but think that these guys must really need an escape from their home lives to be this dedicated. However, there are a lot of participants that like to stay in character, no matter if it's a visitor or another reenactor. Suddenly, I became aware of a cool breeze flowing through the trails. Todd and James bid me good day and soon started walking back to the fair. After a minute or so, I was completely isolated, sitting at the spring. I noticed that I could no longer hear the bustling of the fair, and chalked it up to the dense woodland surrounding me. I sat drinking the cool spring water, soon finishing the cup and found myself dipping the cup in once more. All right, It's time to head back, I said to myself as I stood and prepared to walk back down the trail. I started walking down, and about 10 minutes in, I realized that I could still not hear the fair. No music, no laughter, nothing. I kept walking and began to feel like something was wrong. I must have taken the wrong turn somewhere. I could have sworn this was the way, I thought to myself. Stopping and taking another sip of water from my cup, I felt that strange, cool breeze again. The hair on my arms and neck stood up on end. Something strange was going on here. I walked another 5 minutes or so and could start to hear faint voices in the distance. I picked up my pace. The trees started to thin out, and soon something came into view. It was a wooden wall made of logs. What the hell? I've never seen this before, I said to myself. My stomach started to turn as I had a feeling that something was absolutely wrong. I started to panic a little. I started jogging up and down the log wall and soon found an opening on the opposite side. I took my first look inside this place, and my heart dropped. This looked nothing like the fair. I took a few moments to take it all in, and something told me that this may indeed be a real settlement. There is no way this is happening. This cannot be real. Maybe I'm dehydrated and seeing things. I slowly started to walk into the settlement. There were many horses, either pulling wooden carts, wagons, or even pulling plows in the garden. The ground was muddy and slick. I heard shouts from children running and playing whilst weaving in and out of small one-room cabins throughout the village. I meandered down the main drag when my eyes locked onto the two gentlemen who had shown me the well. I quickly jogged up to them. Guys, seriously, what's going on? Why, what do you mean? James replied. Okay, seriously, will you drop the act for a minute? Where is the fair? I asked with a slightly irritable tone. They stared at me for a moment. Then Todd spoke.
Sir, are you feeling okay?
Maybe we should fetch the doctor, James stated. I don't need a goddamn doctor. I want to know what in the hell is going on. At this point, a small crowd of people were starting to gather. The crowd consisted of about 7 or 8 people. First, may I ask that you temper your language, sir? I fear that you may have a touch of the fever. Come with us and we shall escort you to the doctor. My blood began to boil and I felt my face turning red. I am completely done with you two. Please take me to someone who knows just what is going on around here, I seethed. As you wish, sir, James stated, as himself and Todd started walking towards the rear of the village. I stayed quiet as we approached a small cabin in the northwest corner of the village. As we stepped up to the door, James knocked twice. Doctor, we have a man here who would wish to speak to you, James said through the door. One moment, I heard the doctor exclaim inside the cabin. I heard a lot of rustling about and items clanking together. Then with a swift click, the door swung open. Good evening, Doctor. Sorry to have bothered you at such a late notice, but we have stumbled across this dear fellow who doesn't seem quite to have his faculties about him. Well then, come on inside. James, Todd, and I stepped into the small cabin. There was a small fire in the hearth, a long desk, a couple of chairs, a bed, and a small dining table in the opposite corner. The desk had several iron instruments strewn across its surface. What seems to be the problem? Okay, I understand that you guys may be way more into this than I am, but please tell me what's going on. This is part of the fair that I have never seen in my life, and I've been attending this fair for 30-odd years. So please, just drop the act and tell me where I'm at. The doctor looked at me with concern. What do you mean where you at? You're in the new land called Ohio, the doctor stated with a concerned tone. Yeah, I'm aware of that. Seriously, what part of the fair are you from? The doctor looked over to James and Todd and approached them. There were hushed whispers, and soon after, James and Todd left the cabin. Wait, where are they going?
They have other business to attend to. Now, please, sir, may I ask your name?
My name is Henry, but look, I just want to know what's going on.
Well, Henry, this is a relatively new town. We are just now starting to plow for our crops, the doctor stated.
I started to feel sick to my stomach because I was slowly realizing that I was not where I was supposed to be, or possibly even when. Okay, doctor. I must not be feeling that great. I even forgot what year it was. Maybe it's the heat.
'Tis the year of our Lord 1781.
1781? There is absolutely no way that this can be true. Feigning recollection and attempting to assimilate to their time period, I spoke.
Oh, yes, sorry, doctor. It must have been my fevered mind. Well, Henry, allow me to prepare something for you that will help you settle, the doctor replied.
He walked over to a small hutch and started pulling small glass containers out. He grabbed a mortar and pestle and began to add different ingredients into the mortar. The doctor then began to grind the ingredients together and proceeded to put them in a small copper cup. He then walked over to the fire and grabbed a steaming kettle from a swinging hearth hook. The doctor walked back over to the table where he poured hot water into the cup. Grabbing the cup, he walked back over to me.
There you are, sir. Drink this. It'll help with the nerves.
What is in this?
Just a few herbs to help with fever. Helps with nerves as well.
All right. Thank you, doctor. I took a sip of the hot concoction. I noticed a strong aroma of mint. There were a few rosemary leaves tossed in, and what I also believed were bits of clove. The mixture was strong, but not too horrible tasting.
Now, Mr. Henry, if I may, you seemed quite worked up the moment you arrived. May I ask where you were traveling from?
Thinking up a quick story, I explained.
Well, I'm from a smaller settlement about 10 miles southeast from here. I find that quite interesting. We have been building here since early February, and I do not recall seeing any other settlement before this place here. Must be fairly new.
Yes, sir, it is new. My family and I just completed our home, and I was traveling to find food and scout out the land, I said while taking another sip of the drink.
I see. And how is it that you've traveled here? I see no horse nor wagon in sight.
I walked, sir.
So, if I am understanding this correctly, you established a home with your family and came looking for food and scouting out land.
Yes, sir. Well, not exact, the doctor interrupted me.
With no rifle? No knives or supplies of any kind?
The doctor asked with a suspicious look on his face. I started to perspire slightly. I had to dig down and really come up with something to validate my story. Doctor, I actually prefer to trap small game with snares made of sapling wood. I find it the most effective way to ensure a fresh kill every time. I don't need much, maybe some water, and I can forage for berries along the way. I noticed that the doctor's facial expression relaxed a bit, not looking as suspicious.
I see. And for that you need nothing? Tell me, Mr. Henry, how would you go about dispatching your catch?
Usually I pin it down if still alive and hit it with a large rock. Once dispatched, I carry it back home where my tools are for preparing my catch. The doctor stared at me for what seemed like 20 seconds or so.
Well, then I believe maybe it would be best for you to lie down and get some rest, the doctor said as he slapped his thighs and stood.
I don't know if that would be necessary, sir.
Judging by what James and Todd told me about your odd behavior in the streets, I believe it may be best for you and all around that you get some rest. You may use this bed over here. There's hot water for tea, and if you require anything else, just say so. I have to pay a visit to someone, and I shall return promptly.
the doctor said as he put on his jacket. The doctor opened his door and walked out without saying another word. I took this time to look around a bit in the small cabin. I rifled through a small desk that was sitting next to the hutch. I found several correspondence letters from a variety of other settlements, the most prominent one being from Jamestown requesting the doctor's return. I put the letters back where I found them and walked over to the bed. It was made up in the old style, rope bed construction with a mattress made of straw. I sat. I closed my eyes and rubbed my face. This cannot be real. I've got to be dreaming. Maybe if I do sleep a little, I'll wake up. Maybe I passed out or something on the way to the spring, I thought to myself. I laid down on the bed after placing my hat on the small end table. Soon I drifted off to sleep with my mind swirling with possibilities of what could have led me to this particular predicament. I awoke to the door being flung open by the doctor. Following the doctor were two men dressed in full Continental military regalia. The two military men walked over to me and started asking questions. "Sir, what is your name and where are you from?" one of the Continentals said. "Hasn't the doctor told you?" I replied. "Sir, we have scouted out 30 miles or so in every direction. There is not nor ever has been any sign of any other settlement." "I don't know what to tell you. That is where I am from," I said as I started to stand. The two men seemed to be slightly startled by my movement and shifted into defensive positions. "On behalf of the Continental Army, we are going to have to take you and escort you to another location," the man said. "Hold on. Wait a minute." As I started to speak, one of the men grabbed my right arm and started to pull me towards the door. "What is going on? I have a right to know," I exclaimed. The man stopped and the other Continental grabbed a hold of my haversack bag and started searching it. "We have reason to believe that you may be a spy. We are holding you until proven otherwise." "A spy? What?" I said. I then realized that they said the year was 1781. The Revolutionary War hadn't ended until 1783. My blood ran cold as I realized that they were truly holding me as a prisoner. "What in the devil is this?" the man searching my bag exclaimed. The man held up my cell phone. Both men jumped a bit when the screen automatically flicked on. On the background of the phone was a picture of the smiling faces of my wife and daughter. I had noticed that in the top right corner where the signal bar should be, read SOS. The man dropped the phone the moment he saw the screen turn on. "What type of devil's game is this? Are you mad?" the man growled. The phone was lying there on the dirt floor, and soon the screen went back to black. "Take him away!" Suddenly I was thrust in front of the soldier and pushed out of the doorway and into the streets. The men stopped and tied my arms together with leather straps. Then they placed heavy iron cuffs on my wrists. We began walking towards the center of the village. One soldier in front of me leading the way, I dared not try and struggle because the other soldier behind me had his rifle pushed against my back. We walked into a smaller structure. The structure was dark. The only light permeated through the small cracks in the roof and walls. There was a wooden support pole in the middle of the structure. The Continental soldiers then unbound me, placing my back against the pole, and tied my arms together behind the pole. "Why are you doing this to me?" I asked. "You ought not be asking any questions at the moment. Lieutenant Colonel Stacy will be here in a couple of days. You may then plead your case," one of the men said. The two men swiftly walked out of the doorway and shut it. I heard what sounded like a wooden crossbeam slide down and bar the door from the outside. For several hours I heard nothing but faint yelling of children running around the village. Occasionally I heard footsteps shuffling towards the door of the structure. I had slid down the post and sat on the dirt and straw-covered floor. I began to sink into a deep state of sorrow as I continued to think about the gravity of the situation that I was in. Before much longer, I heard the wooden bar on the other side of the door lift up and away. The door opened. One of the soldiers who brought me here walked up to me. "I'm going to release your shackles momentarily. Any sign of a fight and the other soldier will fire at will." "Okay," I said, slightly nodding. The soldier released my shackles and leather bindings. I was spun around and he grabbed my arms and reshackled my wrists around the pole so that my arms were no longer behind me. The soldier then produced a small piece of bread and a small metal cup full of water. He placed the bread and cup on the floor at my feet. "Just to keep you alive," the soldier said. I said nothing. The soldier then turned and left the building. I heard the wooden bar slide back into place. I sat back down and reached for the bread and took a bite. It was extremely dry, so I lifted the small metal cup and took a sip. I noticed that the metal cup's handle was slightly loose and water was leaking out of one of the holes used to rivet the handle in place. I drank the water until it was below that hole in order to keep the remaining water inside. Evening was slowly approaching and the light emanating through the cracks of the structure started to fade into complete darkness. Before long, I saw another source of light coming through the small cracks in the doorway. Looked like fire the way it was flickering, possibly a torch. I began to feel tired and leaned my shoulder and head on the post and fell asleep shortly after. I awoke to a loud thump on the door.
"What are you doing? Stay clear, I say!"
Someone shouted from outside the door. My arms and shoulder were sore from leaning on that post for what must have been several hours. I was thirsty. I drank what was left in the cup. As I took the last sip, the top portion of the handle came loose. I suddenly came to the realization that I could potentially use this handle to pick the locks on my shackles. I wiggled the handle back and forth for a few minutes until it finally came loose from the cup. I quickly felt around for the lock on my shackles, and upon locating it, I attempted to stick the handle ends into the keyhole. Luckily, they were the old screw-top cuffs. I was able to latch onto something inside the locking mechanism and was able to eventually unlock the cuff to my left arm. I freed myself from the post, trying not to make much noise. I quickly unlocked the right cuff.
"Have you checked on the prisoner?"
I heard someone say outside of the door. No sooner than that being said, the wooden bar raised again. I quickly shoved the shackles back on my wrists and hid the broken handle under my leg. The door opened.
"You! Are you still alive?"
one of the soldiers said. I turned my head slightly to face him.
"Yeah, I am." "Good. We will check on you at first morning light. Guards will be in front of this door all night."
The soldier turned and closed the door. I did not hesitate to remove my shackles once again. I knew that I had to come up with a plan. There had to be several hours at least before dawn. I pondered my escape. I was tired, but I managed to keep myself awake and alert. I devised a plan that may possibly just work. I would wait until the first guard came to check on me in the morning, and unbeknownst to him, I will be standing just inside the door as it swings open. I'll attempt to knock him down and make a run for it. I sat for a few more hours and started seeing thin lines of purple light from the rising sun. My heart began to beat faster as I heard footsteps approach the door. I stood up and prepared to run for my life. The wooden bar was removed, and just as they were pulling the door open, I rammed the door. It took a considerable amount of force to knock through two of the guards that were standing on the other side. My natural strength combined with adrenaline allowed me to surprise them and knock them over. I began to run. Running as fast as I could, I located the village exit and headed that way.
"To arms! Find him!"
I heard one of the soldiers yell. I kept pushing. My feet were hitting the ground harder and faster than ever before. I rounded the village exit, almost running headfirst into two men who appeared to be coming back from a hunt. They had several rabbits hung over their shoulders. Quickly dodging them, I made a break for the woodlands. I kept running until I could no longer hear yelling behind me. My chest was pounding. It felt like 1,000 knives stabbing my lungs each time I drew a breath in. I stopped and turned around to look behind me. I saw nothing except trees and bushes. There was a large boulder just to the right of me, and I decided to hunker down behind it for a moment to catch my breath. I sat down behind the rock, resting my back on its cool surface. I waited there about 10 minutes or so, and then stood up. I still did not see anyone behind me. I decided to keep running, changing directions every 200 yards or so. I must have traveled for at least 4 to 5 miles. I slowed my pace to a fast walk, feeling confident that I had eluded the soldiers for the time being. I walked for several more miles until I arrived at a small creek. I started to follow the creek for another mile or so, and then froze in my tracks when I heard what sounded like a voice. I noticed a large fallen tree about 10 feet away or so. I began to get down on my hands and knees to crawl toward the tree for cover. Leaning against the tree, I started to hear footsteps swishing through the creek a little farther up ahead. I slowly raised my head above the tree's massive trunk to try and see what was happening. Peering ahead, probably 80 to 90 feet upstream, I saw what looked like a true-blooded Native American. I watched him for several seconds until a large walnut fell off a tree above me and made a loud splashing noise. I saw the native look in my direction, so I ducked down behind the tree again quickly. I heard him yell. Then suddenly it sounded as if he were running in my direction. I stood up and started running away from him. He kept yelling and I kept running until I heard this.
Wait, friend!
I slowed my running down to a walk and looked back. The native was holding his hands up in the air as though he was symbolizing that he was not a threat. I stopped and turned to face him. I allowed the native to walk closer to me, and as he came into focus, I noticed that he looked awfully familiar.
Wait, Mike? Is that you?
I exclaimed. The native had a confused look on his face.
No, name is Red Wolf.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You look almost identical to one of my friends,
I said while still trying to catch my breath. Red Wolf stuck out his right arm like he was going to shake my hand. I reached out and he grabbed the inner part of my forearm closer to my elbow. I matched his gesture. Red Wolf shook my arm as I shook his.
My name is Henry,
I stated.
Henry.
Strong name, Red Wolf replied.
I'm sorry if I'm interrupting anything. You see, I was being chased.
Chased? By a Continental? Red Wolf asked.
Yes. How did you know?
I asked in return.
I see many times strange people come. This area is powerful. Many people get lost. Don't know where to go. I find them. Always here,
Red Wolf explained.
Many people? So you've seen a lot of people come through here?
I asked.
Spirit of the trees and earth guide me. I come look and find others.
I'm sorry, but how do you know English so well?
We do trade with settlers. Crops for weapons, medicine.
Oh, I see.
So you know the village back that way?
I pointed in the direction that I'd come from.
Yes, many trade there.
Suddenly, piercing the silence of the quiet woods were heavy footfalls and twigs and sticks breaking. Voices of the Continental soldiers rang out.
He can't be far. Find him. Bring him back.
I looked at Red Wolf with a look of panic.
Come, follow,
Red Wolf said. Red Wolf began darting through the trees and across the creek. I stayed right on his heels. We ran for what seemed like 20 minutes. Finally, we approached a small Native American village. There were huts made of branches and tree bark, teepees, and several thatch-roofed clay homes. As we entered the village, Red Wolf instructed me to go into one of the huts. I crawled inside first and Red Wolf after.
You stay. I go out to meet Continentals.
Red Wolf said. Okay, I replied. Approximately 15 minutes went by, and then I started to hear the yelling of the Continental soldiers entering the village. I heard murmured conversation. The conversing lasted for about 5 minutes, and then I heard what sounded like the soldiers heading back in the direction that they had come. Shortly after that, Red Wolf entered the hut. Are they gone? I asked. Yes. I tell them no stranger here. We say never saw anyone. A long sigh of relief exited my lungs. Thank God. I thought I was about to get captured again. No, they trust us. We teach how to grow food. All right, then. So, may I ask you a question? Yes. So, back there in the woods, you were saying that many people come through here. What exactly did you mean by that? Other settlers? Red Wolf thought about his answer for a moment. No. People like you. Like me. What do you mean? People from a different land. I have seen many. I have helped many. Many lose their way. I grow to help. Strange power comes from the river. I thought about this answer for a moment or two. How do you know to help them? I see the look on their face. It's a look of fear and loss. Somehow I know I am meant to help. You see, all creatures are connected. The trees, the water, the wind, all share the same spirit. So did you know I was out there? What were you doing there so far from your village? I felt a shift in the winds and knew something was happening. I follow my inner guide, the wolf. Red Wolf grabbed the talisman that he wore around his neck. It was a carving of a wolf's head crafted from bone. He looked at it by the light of the small fire in the hut, as though he were lost in deep thought. So you knew I was out there? I did not know for sure. I just knew to keep walking. I was guided by the spirits. Then I saw you. When I saw you close, I felt you were connected in some way. I knew I had to help. I took a moment to take all this in. Red Wolf stoked the fire a bit, causing the flames to rise a little higher. The walls of the hut came into light, with various animal skins hung on them. Antlers and hooves lined the top of the walls. A small crude table was on the far opposite side of the hut. Atop the table were several knives, arrows, and spearheads. I looked back over to Red Wolf. So you said you have helped people in the past. How did you help them? I showed them their way. Some did fail. Some made it home. Are you able to help me get back home? Only if you listen to your heart. Accept the spirits of the land. They will lead you home if you listen, Red Wolf stated. How do I do that? Time for rest, friend. You'll sleep now. Red Wolf unrolled the deer pelt on the far side of the hut and instructed me to lay down. He handed me a hollowed-out gourd filled with water. Drink now. Sleep, Red Wolf said. I did as he instructed. I drank plentifully from the gourd, then set it down next to me. I laid down and let the exhaustion envelop me. I soon fell asleep while listening to the crackle of the fire. The morning soon arrived, and Red Wolf was shaking my shoulder. Time to rise. We must go. Go where? Remains to be seen. Red Wolf walked over and grabbed a few arrows in his longbow. He had slung a deerskin quiver upon his back and motioned towards the door of the hut. I slowly stood and stretched. That was probably the best sleep I've had in a while. and to that fact I was surprised due to the circumstance that I currently found myself in. I walked out of the hut into the bright morning sun. I looked up to see the green leaves from the long tree branches. It seemed as though the trees were surrounding us and protecting us from anything else.
"Come, this way,"
Red Wolf said. I followed him out into the dense woodland. We walked for a while, and soon we found ourselves back at the very creek we had met.
"I show you our way,"
Red Wolf said. He held his right index finger up to his mouth, signaling me to stay quiet. Then he put his hand lower towards the ground with the palm facing down, indicating that he wanted me to stay where I was. He then started creeping forward silently as he withdrew the bow from his back and an arrow from the quiver. Red Wolf kept walking forward slowly and lowered himself to a half-crouching position. I watched silently as he drew back the bow. I tried to see what he was aiming at. However, I could not see anything. With a sudden swish, the arrow was released from the bow at lightning speed. Red Wolf stood there for a moment and then signaled me to follow. We trampled through knee-high vegetation and around several trees. Red Wolf stopped about 10 feet in front of me and looked down. I walked up next to him to find an 8-point buck lying on the ground with an arrow dug deep into its chest cavity. I watched as Red Wolf bent down and closed the eyes of the animal. I believe he said some type of prayer in his native language, then stood and looked at me.
"We thank spirits of the earth and release spirit of the deer, thanking for its sacrifice to keep us nourished. Begin as part of the earth, end as part of the earth."
This was a humbling moment. The love and care that these natives have for the earth and all the creatures upon it. Red Wolf pulled his arrow from the deer. He had shot and killed a deer from at least 50 yards away with one swift, deadly shot. I was amazed at his accuracy. He then began making incisions with the arrow across the belly of the deer. He skillfully cleaned the deer and then tied a rope to all 4 legs, bringing them together. I watched as he angled himself in such a way to hoist the deer upon his shoulders. I followed him back to his village in silence. Arriving at the village, he met up with some of the other natives that helped butcher the deer, and they soon had meat hung on sticks over the fire. Red Wolf introduced me to several other tribe mates. I stood and listened to their stories of experiences they have with other settlers, some good and some not so great. Tales of some skirmishes with other settlements that forced them to move to where they are now. Red Wolf took me back out to a different part of the woodlands and showed me how to use his longbow. I shot off a few arrows and soon felt that I had a decent handle on using the bow.
"Now focus. Deep breath. Breathe. Release."
I took a deep breath and fired my final arrow. The arrow struck a tree and fell instantly to the ground. Upon inspection, the tip of the arrow had shattered. There was a distinct pattern of red flint that was striped through the arrow.
"Arrow broke. Not good for hunting. Come, we must get back."
Red Wolf and I started walking back to the village. The day was slowly fading to dusk when we arrived back. The tribe were dancing around the fire, beating drums and singing their ancestral songs.
"What are they singing about?" "Giving thanks for food. Thanking the spirits that connect us all."
"Oh, I see." Red Wolf and I approached the ceremony. He joined in the ceremony as I took a place sitting on a nearby log. I sat and watched as they danced and played music around the fire. The dance continued for about 20 minutes. I was entranced at the sight. They all seemed so spiritual and intentional in their actions, their steps, their every movement. Soon after the music ended, the tribe started harvesting the meat off the fire and handing it to each other. Red Wolf grabbed 2 softball-sized pieces of meat and started walking my way.
"Eat, for nourishment.
Red Wolf said as he sat down on the log next to me. Without hesitation, I grabbed the venison and took a large bite. The meat was juicy and flavorful. The juice ran down my chin as I continued to devour the food. Juices covering my hands and lap as I shoved the last bite into my mouth. After I finished chewing, I looked over at Red Wolf. He was halfway done with his food. He noticed me staring at him. "Only a fool eats fast on an empty stomach." I laughed. "Oh, yeah? You should see some of the heavily processed foods that I stopped speaking because I realized that he would have no idea as to what I was talking about. Red Wolf just smiled and resumed eating his food. I noticed that after most of the tribe was done eating, they gathered around the fire. There were people talking about their day and how good the food was. Once Red Wolf had finished, he rinsed his hands with a tiny bit of water from his gourd canteen. He then took a sip of the water and offered the canteen to me. I took the canteen and took a long swallow of cool water. "Thank you," I said. Red Wolf nodded. "When do you think you will be going back to the village that was chasing me?" "I do not know." "Well, I was just asking because they still have my bag. I have personal belongings in that bag that are important to me, so I'd like to retrieve them." "We go now," Red Wolf said. "Now? Like, right now? It's dark. Won't we get lost?" Red Wolf just smiled and chuckled as he rose to his feet. "Come, we go." I stood up and started to follow him out of his village. As we walked by the rest of the tribe, one older man stepped in my path. "Yankuna, Osun, Pasana Pataki," the old man said as he waved a stick in front of me. He then pushed his finger into a red substance and brushed it over my right eye. "For a safe passage. Village healer," Red Wolf said. I looked at the old man and nodded a sign of appreciation. The man nodded back and stepped out of my way. "We go now," Red Wolf said. I followed Red Wolf out into the dark woodland. We walked for about an hour, and I noticed that the moon was especially bright out. The moon and stars were brighter than I had ever seen. This made it a lot easier to see where we were going. We met up with the creek and followed for what seemed like miles. Red Wolf then took a hard right back into the dense woodland. We kept traveling in that direction for quite some time until I started seeing a faint light in the distance through the trees. Red Wolf stopped. "Settlers," he said in a hushed tone. "What do we do now?" "Stay quiet. Follow." Red Wolf started creeping towards the settlement as I followed in his very footsteps. Soon we reached that old familiar log wall that I had seen when first stumbling upon the settlement. Red Wolf stayed close to the wall as we crept around to the back of the settlement. We continued about 20 feet or so and stopped. "We go here," Red Wolf said as he pointed to a small opening in between one of the logs. The opening was just big enough for a man to squeeze through. "I go first. Then I tell you when you go," he said quietly. "Okay," I whispered. Red Wolf stuck his head into the opening and looked around, then squeezed his body through and disappeared from view. I quickly shuffled up to the opening and saw Red Wolf with his back leaning against one of the cabins. He took another look around and then looked back at me. He signaled for me to enter. I squeezed through the opening and met him alongside the cabin. We crept to the corner of the cabin and Red Wolf stopped to peer around the corner. He quickly pulled his head back and flattened his back against the cabin. I followed suit. I started to hear voices and footsteps. The door to the cabin opened and someone walked inside. We heard the door close. Red Wolf looked around the corner a second time. He signaled me to follow him. We rushed across the alleyway that was half lit by a torch on the outside of one of the cabins. We ducked into a small, dark, 3-foot wide space that was in between a cabin and the settlement wall. Red Wolf and I began crawling quietly to the other end of the cabin. Red Wolf looked around the corner of this cabin, finding the coast was clear. We slinked down to the other side of the cabin and noticed a small window on this side. Red Wolf peered inside. "We here," he whispered. I stood up to look into the window. Sure enough, it was the doctor's cabin. I did not see anyone inside. I looked around the cabin interior and spied my haversack bag on the doctor's desk. "Yeah, there it is. How do we get inside?" Red Wolf started to push softly on the window, and it started to open from the side on a swivel. I looked at Red Wolf, and he had his hands clasped together, palms up, and nodded at me. I put my foot in his hands, and he hoisted me up through the window. I carefully navigated myself through the window and over the bed that was just below me. Once fully inside, I walked over to my haversack bag. Upon inspection, everything seemed to be there except for my phone. I began looking everywhere in the cabin and finally came to the desk drawer. Upon opening the drawer, there sat my phone. I grabbed the phone and tossed it into my haversack and quickly jaunted back to the window, picking up my tricorn hat along the way. As I was lowering myself down outside the window, I heard the door open to the doctor's cabin. Laughter was heard as he bid another person good night. I finished lowering myself and then stood and peeked through the window. The doctor was stumbling around his cabin, clearly intoxicated. He looked in my direction, and I ducked down and laid in the dark shadows. Red Wolf and I held our breath for several moments. Suddenly we heard the window moving. "I don't recall having opened this," the doctor said with slurred speech. The doctor then began chuckling to himself as we heard the window close in a loud against the cabin wall. Red Wolf and I waited there for a good 5 minutes or so, and finally heard snoring coming from within the cabin. I stood back up and peered back into the cabin one last time. The doctor had fallen into his bed and passed out due to his drunken state. Red Wolf signaled for me to follow him back to the opening in the wall. We crept back the same way we came, avoiding as much light as we could and making little noise. We both managed to squeeze back through the opening and free ourselves from the settlement. Red Wolf and I started making our way back through the woodland on the very same trail that had led me here. We walked the uphill trail for about 10 minutes and came upon a familiar sight, the old spring. The dawn had started breaking, and golden rays of light mixed with reds, pinks, and blues spread throughout the treetops. "You go home," Red Wolf said. "How? How do I get back?" Red Wolf pointed at the spring. "Drink." I pulled out the old tin cup from my haversack and bent over to fill the cup. I stopped before it touched the water and stood back up. "Why wait?" Red Wolf asked with a confused look on his face. "I'm not really sure. I just feel like maybe I'll never see you again." "We are all connected. You will see me in the next life," Red Wolf replied. I walked over to him and extended my right arm just as he did when we first met. Red Wolf looked and grabbed my forearm in a fierce grip. He smiled, and with his other hand he patted my right shoulder. "I'll see you again, friend." He then motioned toward the spring and turned. Red Wolf started walking back through the dense woodland. I stood and watched him disappear into the trees. Smiling, I bent over and filled my cup. I raised the cup as kind of a cheers to Red Wolf. I closed my eyes and took a long drink. I thought about how everything is connected, how the rivers, trees, and earth all have a spirit. I thought about how we should all remember this and have the same respect for everything as they did. Moments later, I felt the cool breeze rush up onto me through the trees. I opened my eyes. I noticed the sun was a little higher in the sky than before. appeared to be around noon. I started hearing faint music from guitars and bagpipes. The distinct aromas of food and campfire. I poured the rest of the water out of my cup back into the spring. Walking back down the pathway, the music became louder and the scents more prominent. A couple of minutes later, I found myself walking into a large opening with many canvas tents. People walking around with modern clothing and taking pictures. I'm back, I whispered to myself. I was curious, though, of the fact that I had just spent several days in the past. So how did I end up right back here? I remember sweeping the thought away because it didn't matter. I was home. The instant relief of being home again swept over me like a heated blanket on a cold night. I looked to my left toward the tavern at the top of the hill and noticed my friend Mike still sitting there where I had left him. I started walking towards him and stopped dead in my tracks as I saw two men dressed in Continental uniforms walk by with rifles on their shoulders. The two men kept walking and looked at me, nodded their heads, and kept walking away. It took me a second to realize that I was holding my breath. I released my breath and continued walking up the hill. "Hey, man, your stuff is all safe and sound," Mike said. I looked down at my lute guitar and stared for a moment. "You okay, man?" Mike asked me, snapping me out of my trance. "Yeah, man, I'm good. I think that Scotch egg must have messed with me. I think I'm going to gather my things and head back to the tent for a while. Also, sorry that I was gone so long. It's no problem. You weren't gone but about 10 minutes. But you go take care of yourself. You sure you're okay?" "Yeah, I'm good. I just think I need to lie down for a while." I collected my items and started heading back to camp. I felt even more relief when I saw all of my creature comforts still waiting for me in my tent. I opened one of the coolers and saw an ice-cold beer. I grabbed the beer and popped it open. The fizz and smell of the beer was heavenly to me. "Man, I needed this," I said to myself. Taking the first few sips of beer, I set it on an old wooden chest next to my bedroll. I decided to lay down and sleep for a while. I laid on my back and placed my tricorn hat over my face. I fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up because Mike was calling my name from outside the tent. "Hey, Henry, you good?" "Yeah, much better. I needed that." I stood up and stretched. Unfastening the flaps of my tent, I saw Mike stoking the fire. The twilight of dusk was once again descending on the park. Grabbing my unfinished beer, I walked out of the tent and over to a stump that I had used for a chair and sat down. "You missed out on most of the fun today, man." I chuckled. "I had plenty of fun. Trust me." "Okay. Sleeping?" Mike said, puzzled. Once again, I just chuckled. Mike shook his head and went back to stoking the fire. I sat and listened since the music had faded and heard the wind rustle in the treetops. I thought of Red Wolf and how he had taught me so much. Mike had thrown a couple beer brats on the gridirons over the fire. It reminded me of the venison and how good it was. "Hey, Mike," I said. "Yeah? I think maybe in the morning I may pack up my things. I think I've had enough of this weekend. I kind of miss my family." "What? It's only been 2 days. Only 1 day left. We look forward to this every year." "Listen, man, I'm not saying that you have to leave. I can always come back Monday and pick you up." "Well, okay then, if that's what you want to do. I'm not going to miss the rest of the fair, though." "I understand." We sat by the fire, watched the brats as they sizzled. We ate the brats once they were done cooking, and shortly after, we turned in for the night. I slept like a rock. The morning came within minutes, it seemed. I woke myself up with a cup of coffee that Mike had percolated in a pot over the fire. "You sure you want to leave?" Mike asked. "Yeah, I'm sure." "All right, man. Well, I'm going to head back out to the fair. I'll see you Monday?" "See you Monday, man." I started packing my things into various containers and deconstructed my tent. It took me about an hour and a half to trek everything out to the car, several trips just on my own. I sat behind the wheel of my car and laughed. If I only had this car with me, I wonder what Red Wolf would have thought then, I said, chuckling to myself. I shifted the car into drive and started my journey home. 15 minutes later, I was pulling into my driveway. I shifted the car into park and climbed out. My wife met me halfway up the sidewalk.
What are you doing home? I thought you weren't supposed to be back until Monday.
My wife asked. I guess I just missed my family. I gave her a kiss and walked into the house where my daughter greeted me. I reached down and picked her up and squeezed her in a tight hug. Moments later, my wife came back inside.
Since you're home, you mind if I run out and get a case of water? You took most of ours,
my wife said. Yeah, that's fine.
What's so funny?
Nothing, babe. Just glad to be home.
Well, I'll be back in a few.
I walked over to the refrigerator and opened it. One last bottle of water. I grabbed the water and twisted the cap off. I guess I should be more careful where I get my water, I said. I closed my eyes and took a drink.
Chilling tales for dark nights.